Hi, everybody. Tonight, I want to take you far away from the world we know, into a time of firelight and frozen fjords, of heavy sails and salt-washed timber, where the night stretched long and the winds carried more than just the scent of the sea. We are stepping gently into the mysterious world of the Vikings, not the fierce raiders and sword bearers that history so often glorifies, but the soft, private lives behind the shields, into their hearts, their homes, and their hidden passions. This is a tale about what intimacy, what sex was really like for the Vikings, and it's a story not of conquest or battle, but of longing, tenderness, jealousy, and quiet rituals by the hearth. Over the next 24 chapters, we'll journey together through sagas not often told, secret encounters in the longhouses, ancient fertility rites, the rules that bound love and the ones that shattered it. We'll hear the murmurs of women whose names were lost, feel the breath of God's whispering desire in the stillness of northern nights, and walk beside lovers whose world was cold but whose warmth endured. So if you're ready, lay your head down, let the crackle of the fire lull you, and listen as we begin at the beginning, not with warriors, but with quiet eyes across a crowded feast. The longhouse was warm with the scent of roasted meat, pine resin, and human breath. Torches flickered from wooden beams, casting amber shadows on the walls, while low voices rose and fell like waves. On nights like this, when the icy wind howled just beyond the thick turf roof, people huddled close, sharing more than heat. There was music, ale, stories, and the kind of subtle glances that spoke far more than words. In this shared warmth, intimacy wasn't hidden. It wasn't shameful. Among the Norse, physical closeness was a part of the rhythm of life, woven into their stories, their rituals, and even their politics. You might think of the Vikings as rough, brutal men swinging axes, but the truth is far more tender, far more complicated. And it often began in moments like these, beside the fire, with a song echoing off the beams and a glance that lingered just a heartbeat too long. Marriage, for Vikings, was as much about strategy as affection. Families would arrange unions to cement alliances, merge property, or settle feuds. But even in these arrangements, desire found its way. During feasts, young people danced and drank and flirted. They touched hands, leaned in close under the pretense of being heard, and let the ale loosen the knots of modesty. The Vikings believed in pleasure and in its power. It wasn't forbidden, it was expected. Men and women had more sexual freedom than most societies of their time. A girl might be promised in marriage, but that didn't mean she hadn't already explored intimacy. In the sagas, women are not shy. They tease, they seduce, they speak boldly about what they want. Sex was not just a male pursuit, it was mutual. In some cases, women held more control than the men they lay with. They could initiate divorce, they could mock a man for being bad in bed. And their reputations, though precious, were not as fragile as one might think. But shame, there were lines not to be crossed. A man who was too passive, too unmanly in his desires, could be mocked in poetry and shunned in society. The Vikings had strong ideas about masculinity, not just about strength, but about taking the lead. Still, within the bounds of a marriage or a quiet encounter, there was room for softness, for laughter, for lingering touch. In the middle of winter, the night seemed to last forever. That was when stories were told, some of gods, others of lovers. The god Freyr, for example, was a deity of fertility, his arousal so strong it could bring crops from the earth. And Freya, the goddess of love and battle, was said to take many lovers, and yet none could shame her. These were the stories the Vikings told their children, their neighbors, their gods. They weren't prudish, they weren't silent. Desire was a part of life as much as war or harvest. And yet love was not always gentle. The sagas speak of betrayal, of jealous spouses, of men who vanished into the night, never to return. There were accusations of sorcery, of women who lured men with spells or cursed their loins. A woman who dared to step outside the bonds of marriage risked more than whispers. But so did a man who touched what wasn't his. Still, not all was punishment and pain. Many found warmth in long winters, shared pelts, and whispered dreams. Lovers met in barns or in forests, far from prying eyes. They made promises not with rings, but with whispered oaths and carved runes. The Norse believed that fate bound two souls before birth, and sometimes that bond could not be denied, no matter what family or law decreed. What did it feel like to lie with someone in a Viking longhouse? Imagine it, the rough weave of wool against skin, the scent of pine smoke in your hair, the silence of a snow-covered world outside. You could hear every breath, every heartbeat, every crack of the fire. There was no privacy, yet somehow there was more intimacy. Eyes met in darkness, bodies moved beneath fur, and the rest of the world fell away. Sex was not just pleasure, it was power, it was legacy. A child conceived could inherit land or shame or nothing at all. The woman's place in society often shifted with motherhood, but pleasure? That was not reserved just for reproduction. The Vikings believed in enjoying what life offered, because life was short and death was certain. So they made love with intensity, with reverence, and sometimes with reckless joy. They told stories of lovers who defied death. They carved their names beside those they cherished, hoping the runes would outlast their bones. And perhaps that's why their stories survived, not because of how they fought, but because of how deeply they lived. Now, as the fire dims and the night wraps us in silence, remember this. The Vikings were more than warriors. They were dreamers, lovers, and poets of the flesh. And this is just the beginning. Shall we go deeper? In the quiet hours before dawn, the longhouse whispered with the breath of sleepers and the distant creak of timbers adjusting to the cold. The hearth embers glowed faintly, casting the faintest hue on the low beams above. In this hush, intimacy lived not only in the acts of passion, but in the rituals that surrounded it. The slow undressing after a feast, the shared drink before bed, the gentle curling of two bodies under shared fur as snow gathered silently outside. Viking intimacy did not always begin with fire. Often it started with something much more fragile, permission. A glance, yes, but also a gesture, an offering of mead, the brushing of fingers when handing a bowl. It was not always loud nor crude. The idea of ravishing conquest that so many later stories fixate on was less common than one might think. Desire in Viking society was bound with respect, with an almost reverent admiration for strength, cunning, and fertility. Among the farming families, the pulse of life was ruled by the seasons. Winter brought people closer, physically, emotionally, sometimes reluctantly. There was no escape from each other in the longhouse. Entire families, extended kin, workers, and slaves slept under one roof. Privacy was a luxury few could afford. But that didn't mean passion paused. Instead, it found corners, moments stolen behind hanging furs or muffled beneath the clatter of feast cleanup. Bodies learned to move in silence. Emotions learned to speak in glances. And it wasn't only the free men and women who experienced desire. The Viking world was complex. Slavery, thralls as they were called, was deeply ingrained. Thralls could be born into servitude, captured in raids, or even sold by their families in times of hardship. Their lives were hard, but within the darkness of those lives, stories of affection still flickered. Some thralls formed bonds with their masters. Others were taken without consent, their voices erased by the cold formality of ownership. But there are quiet mentions in the sagas, rare and soft, of love that bloomed unexpectedly, of a master who freed his thrall after years together, of a thrall who remained even after she could have walked away. This shadow of power and powerlessness haunted Viking intimacy just as it does every society. A man's strength was measured not only by his sword, but by how many mouths he could feed, how many beds he could fill. For some, desire was a currency. A woman might offer herself in exchange for protection, or food, or position. And while some might read that as tragic, others saw it as strategic. Viking women were not meek. They knew how to wield what they had: beauty, wit, lineage, and they did so with precision. At feasts, one might see a woman lean forward to pour ale for a visiting chieftain, her sleeve slipping ever so slightly to reveal a wrist marked by gold. He would smile perhaps, and later that night, a quiet exchange might unfold behind the smokehouse. But these moments were not always about seduction. They were about negotiation, about presence, about being seen and recognized in a world that demanded so much from women: hard labor, loyalty, childbirth, survival. And yet, there were women who took lovers not for gain, but simply for want. Shield maidens, those rare myth-drenched warriors, were not celibate creatures of battle. They too felt longing. Imagine a woman who had ridden beside men in raids, whose hands bore the calluses of axe and oar, sitting by the fire in her own hall, unbraiding her hair. A visitor, perhaps a poet, arrives to offer news. She pours his drink, listens to his verses, and when the rest of the house sleeps, she gestures for him to stay. No vows, no contracts, just the joining of two who recognize the fire in each other. The Vikings believed in fate. They called it word, a kind of invisible thread spun by the Norns, three mythical women who measured the length and texture of every life. When two people met and something inside them pulled taut, they might say it was the Norns who had planned it. Some relationships were brief, burning bright like a spark on pine bark. Others endured through seasons, wars, births, and deaths. And even when apart, lovers might carve runes into the wood of their ships or the stones by the shore, hoping their feelings would find the other like a whisper carried by the wind. The customs of courtship were simple, yet rich. A man might offer a woman a gift, not flowers, but a comb carved from bone, or a brooch inlaid with silver. If she accepted, it was a promise. If she wore it where others could see, it was a proclamation. But love was not always linear. A rejected suitor might compose poetry, a love spell of sorts, meant to haunt the one who turned him away. In some cases, these verses were so potent, so beautiful that the woman relented. Other times, the poets were mocked, their verses turned back on them like blades. In a world so tuned to storytelling, intimacy became legend. Two hands reaching for each other in the dark could ripple across generations if the tale was good enough. And tales had power. If a man was said to be tender, clever, skilled in the bedfurs, he might find himself sought after by women of far higher station. And if a woman was said to carry fire in her touch, men might cross entire fjords just to feel it. But these stories also taught caution. Too much pride could ruin a man. Too much freedom could ruin a woman. Reputation was everything, and so many kept their desires veiled behind duties, marriages that served property, not passion, children born from obligation, not love. Still, under the pale shimmer of the northern lights, lovers found each other, sometimes briefly, sometimes forever. And when they did, the cold outside mattered little. The longhouse would hold their heat. The carved beams above would bear silent witness. And the gods, so prone to love and lust themselves, would surely smile. Morning in a Viking settlement came slowly. The sky, pale and bruised with mist, spread across the low hills like a veil. Smoke rose lazily from the longhouse chimneys, and the rhythmic clatter of daily labor began to echo across the frozen ground. But even in daylight, where axes struck wood and voices called over fields and fjords, the memory of night lingered, woven into gestures, into the scent of fur, into the soft curve of a wrist catching the light. Intimacy in the Viking world did not disappear with dawn. Rather, it shifted, becoming quieter, more discreet, yet no less powerful. Lovers who had curled together in the night might pass each other silently during morning chores, their eyes touching briefly before slipping away. And within the routines of daily life, affection found other forms. A carved spoon left beside a bowl, a tightened braid, a woven token tucked beneath a cloak. Love did not always speak. It acted softly and without applause. The roles of men and women in Norse households were more nuanced than history often tells. Yes, the man was traditionally the head of the family, the law speaker, the warrior, the one who journeyed outward. But women were the stewards of the hearth, the keepers of life, of lineage, and often of desire. Inside the home, it was the woman who governed the rhythms of warmth, both physical and emotional. She oversaw the stores, the weaving, the healing, the births. And she also governed the spaces where love was made and sustained. A Viking woman had power, even if it was quiet. She could inherit property. She could initiate divorce. She could guard the keys to the household. Not just the literal iron keys hung from her belt, but the keys to trust, intimacy, and daily grace. A man might return from war with silver, but if he had betrayed his vows or humiliated his wife, she could turn him away. And if a wife took a lover, she did so knowing it was not without consequence, but also not without precedent. Among the sagas are tales of women who chose passion over propriety, not scandalously, but boldly. A merchant's wife who grew lonely while her husband traveled south might fall in love with a craftsman who stayed behind. A farmer's daughter might meet a foreign trader at market and share a single night, never to see him again. And though the whispers might follow her, they would fade with the seasons. For in a world so intimate with death, so close to loss and change, Pleasure was rarely dismissed outright. There were also rituals, rites that wrapped intimacy in layers of meaning. One of the most ancient was the blot, a ceremonial sacrifice to the gods, often held during seasonal festivals. These events were communal and sacred, but also sensual. Offerings of food, drink, and sometimes blood were made to deities like Freyr and Freya, who governed fertility and love. People would drink deeply, dance under moonlight, and let go of the restraints that bound them in daily life. It was during such festivals that many unions were formed, not just marriages, but quiet bonds sealed with flesh and breath, not contracts. In these gatherings, garlands were worn, songs were sung, and stories were shared in whispers beside flickering torches. Youths would slip away into the woods, trailing laughter and breathless promises. Elders watched, not with judgment, but with knowing eyes, many of them remembering their own rites of passage under stars long past. Even the language of the Vikings reflected a culture familiar with intimacy. Their words for love, longing, and desire were vivid, often poetic. Ast, love, was not just a sentiment, but an action, a force. Kyrleiker described tenderness, affection, the kind of care that lingers in small touches and shared silences. The sagas spoke of hearts that burned, of hands that trembled, of lovers who swore oaths carved into bone. And while the details were often veiled, the emotions rang true. One of the most telling symbols of Norse intimacy was the bed itself. Unlike the wide open hearth where families gathered, the bed was a private alcove, often curtained off with heavy wool. There, beneath furs and beside warm stone, bodies met in honesty. The bed was not only for sleep or for the act of creating children. It was a place of comfort, of laughter, of secrets. A man might rest his head in a woman's lap after battle, letting her braid his hair and sing to him. A woman might fall asleep with her hand curled in the soft space between his collarbone and chin, feeling the steady rhythm of life continuing on. And then there were the quiet moments that did not fit in sagas or songs. Moments when a husband, returned from sea, kissed his wife's fingertips before speaking, when a woman placed a warm cloth over her lover's eyes, soothing him from a long day in the fields. These were the kinds of intimacy that left no marks, no children, no scandal. But they lingered, all the same, as steady and silent as the fjords that shaped their world. The Norse believed that the dead watched the living. Ancestors lingered in mounds and beneath stones. Perhaps this is why love, too, was handled with care, not hidden, but honored. To love deeply was not weakness, it was courage. In a life shaped by wind and wave, where ships disappeared beyond the horizon and never returned, where childbirth claimed as many lives as battle, love was a defiance, a vow against the cold. So in the early morning light, when two hands met to carry a pail of water, or when a smile was passed over a bowl of warm porridge, it was not just routine, it was an affirmation that even in a world carved by iron, there was still room for warmth, for desire, for something soft to survive. The sea shaped everything. It was not only a path to riches and raids, but a living, breathing force that curled around every Viking story like the salty mist around their ships. The sea carried men to new lands and brought them back changed, sometimes hardened, sometimes haunted, and often it was upon the return from these long journeys that the most delicate negotiations of intimacy began. Imagine a man stepping off his ship after months abroad, his beard thicker, his hands rougher, his eyes tired from the long horizon. He carries gifts, beads from the south, spices from Frankish markets, perhaps even silk if luck had favored him. But these tokens are not the true offering. The real challenge lies in returning not just to a house, but to a home, to a woman who kept the fires burning, who mended the roof, who buried the goat when it fell sick, who raised their child or grieved one lost while he was away. Intimacy after absence was a slow return. A man could not expect to step into a bed still warm with love. He had to listen first, to see his home not as he left it, but as it had become. A woman's hair might be streaked with new gray. Her hands might be calloused from tasks he once shared. And yet, within that distance lived a hunger, a pull toward reconnection. Sometimes it was cautious, filled with apology and gratitude. Other times, it was immediate, a rush of hands and breath and the tearing away of distance in the shadows behind the longhouse. Children watched with wide eyes as their fathers returned, often not knowing whether they'd be met with laughter, silence, or sobs. The first night after a reunion was sacred, not always sexual, but always intimate. A quiet meal, perhaps, or a shared drink, a hand resting on a thigh beneath the table. The soft question whispered, "Are you still mine?" Some men returned with scars not just on the skin, a raid gone wrong, a betrayal, a vision of death that clung to their sleep, and it was in their lover's arms that they slowly stitched themselves back together. Not all women had patience for this. Not all men asked for it. But where love still lived, healing could begin, not through potions or runes, but through closeness. A forehead rested against another, a tear wiped away, a name spoken gently in the dark. There were also men who did not return. Some died at sea, others chose not to. A wife left behind might wait seasons, even years, before believing herself a widow. Until then, she was in limbo, neither married nor free. But desire did not wait. It stirred in her like the first thaw of spring, and in the quiet of the longhouse, she might begin to notice someone new. A friend of the family, a widower, a man whose laughter came too often, whose help was offered too easily. Such unions began slowly, under the watchful eyes of the community. There was risk in reaching too soon, in seeming unfaithful. But eventually, even the most stoic neighbors understood. Life must go on. And if love could find a second root in familiar soil, it was welcomed. In the coastal villages, where the sea was both a giver and taker, intimacy took on a certain rhythm. Lovers never said goodbye easily. A woman might tie a braid of her hair around her husband's wrist before he left, a charm against drowning. A man might carve her name into the haft of his axe, not for protection, but for remembrance. Children born from these unions were raised with stories of where their father had sailed, of what stars had guided him, of how their mother waited every night with a lantern lit. Not all men left willingly. Some were forced by duty or exile, others by the promise of wealth too great to ignore. And while some women stayed loyal to the end, others remarried, finding not just survival, but tenderness. The sagas are filled with such tales, of women who wept by the shore, of men who returned to find new husbands in their beds, of reunions that were tender, and others that ended in blood. And yet, the sea could bring love as well as take it. There were stories of foreign women brought back from distant lands, some as wives, some as thralls, others as prizes. These women, torn from everything they knew, often found themselves at the mercy of their new households. And still, there were those who made a place for themselves, who learned the language, bore children, and became part of the tapestry. Some were loved deeply. Others were never seen as more than strangers. But even in the coldest circumstances, the need for connection endured. The sea also brought men, traders, warriors, wanderers. A village might welcome a guest one night, only to find him lingering weeks later, helping with the harvest, sharing stories, and drawing the attention of someone whose heart had been quiet too long. These short romances were whispered about over fish gutting and flax combing, and though they often ended with the tide, they left something behind, a memory, a warmth, a secret only the bedfurs remembered. There was a saying in the North, the sea takes what it wants and gives what it pleases. And so, every embrace carried with it a certain fragility, a certain urgency. Even in the tenderest moments, lovers knew the truth. This might be the last time. That knowledge didn't dampen the passion, it sharpened it, made it fuller, made it real. And when two bodies met under a sky swollen with stars, the crashing of waves in the distance, they didn't need words. They didn't need promises, only presence, only breath. And somewhere between the tide going out and the tide coming in, love anchored itself again, even if only for a night. There were nights when the northern wind seemed to speak. It howled low and mournful across the thatched roofs, slipped beneath the wooden slats, and stirred the furs on the beds like invisible fingers. On such nights, the stories came more easily. Not the ones of gods and glory, but the quieter ones, tales of longing, of touch, of secret names whispered in sleep. These were not spoken aloud at feasts. They lived in murmured songs, in glances exchanged across firelight, in the soft sighs of old women who remembered love lost before their hair turned to frost. In every Viking village, there was a woman, older, quieter, who carried these stories. She might have once been a seeress, or simply a widow with no more children to raise. She knew the ancient charms, the herbs that cooled fever, and those that stoked desire. Young women came to her in secret, clutching little cloth pouches, asking questions their mothers would not answer. What if I don't want him? What if I want someone else? What if I bleed after? And the old woman would look at them, eyes lined with knowledge, and answer not with fear, but with truth. Because in the Norse world, the body was not an enemy. It was not a shameful vessel to be tamed. It was a vessel of power, of fertility, of strength, of pleasure. And those who knew how to listen to it could command much more than hearth and cradle. Among these whispered traditions were the arts of love, not only the act itself, but all that surrounded it. Preparing for a lover was a ritual, whether done in joy or uncertainty. A girl might comb her hair with oil-slick fingers, twisting it into coils that smelled of juniper and ash. She might rub her skin with lard and crushed herbs to soften it, slip on a tunic stitched with hidden runes to invite passion, or place a small carved charm beneath her tongue to summon courage. Some women carried secrets passed from mother to daughter, how to keep from conceiving, how to bring on a missed moonblood, how to ease pain after a rough joining. These were not spoken of in the open, but they were known deeply, fiercely, and they were not seen as wicked. They were survival. They were control. A woman who could choose when and how she gave herself was a woman who could steer her fate, if only a little. And what of men? They too carried rituals, though fewer and often cloaked in bravado. Before lying with a woman, a man might carve runes onto the haft of his knife, or wear a bracelet gifted by his mother, a talisman of strength and honor. Some bathed in icy streams to purify the body, believing that a cold plunge made the blood surge hot afterward. Others sought the advice of older men, quiet talks shared over sharpening stones and horn cups, full of clumsy metaphors and awkward laughter. But the truth was, no charm or blade or tale could prepare anyone for the first time they reached for another and were not turned away. That moment, when consent was given, when breath was held, when the body became more than muscle, was the real initiation. And it was often soft, even in a world of hard edges. One tale passed down in hushed tones was of Thora, daughter of a weaver, and Eric, a bondsman newly freed. Their love was not permitted. Her family sought a merchant's son. But Thora had seen Eric under the apple trees, his hands gentle with the lambs, his eyes watching hers like something sacred. One night, she crept from her bedding and met him at the edge of the river. There, beneath the willows, they spoke no words. They simply undressed each other slowly, as if afraid the moonlight might vanish if they moved too fast. And when they lay together, it was not an act of rebellion, but of belonging. The village never officially accepted them. They lived at its edge, raising geese and weaving linen, but when they walked to market hand in hand, no one spoke ill. Because love that quiet, that persistent, that whole, it earned its place. Not all unions were so gentle. There were nights when consent was muddied, when drink clouded judgment, when power bent affection into something colder. The Norse were not immune to cruelty. But within their laws, protections did exist. A woman violated could demand restitution. A man dishonored could bring his shame before the thing, the assembly of free men who decided matters of justice. And though the outcomes varied, the community understood that intimacy, like any force, could be misused. Still, the true stories, the ones remembered, were those that balanced rawness with reverence. Two people, bound not by command or coin, but by that strange pull of souls that knew one another before words were needed. Some lovers met through arranged marriage, and yet love bloomed after. A man waked one morning beside the wife chosen for him and noticed the way she smiled in her sleep, the way she stirred the porridge with a rhythm that made him think of waves. And she, in turn, might watch him stack firewood, shirt clinging to his back, and feel something unexpected settle in her chest. Other lovers never wed. They met once, under a full moon, or behind a stall at the midsummer fair, and though they never shared a home, they shared a memory so vivid it glowed within them for years. A smell, a sound, a pressure of lips, enough to shape dreams long after gray crept into their hair. The Vikings did not separate love from the body, nor the body from fate. They lived as though every moment could be their last, not out of fear, but because they understood the value of presence. A hand on the thigh, a whisper in the ear, the weight of another's breath against your neck. These were not distractions from life. They were life. And in the quiet corners of the longhouse, behind woven curtains or beneath the eaves where mice scurried in straw, those moments pulsed like embers, glowing, waiting, sacred. The turning of the year was marked not only by the sun and stars, but by the body. As winter melted slowly into spring, the Viking world stirred from its slumber. Ice broke along the riverbanks, snow retreated into the hills, and with it, the people unfurled from their shelters like the first green buds. There was a soft awakening in everything. Beasts mated in the fields, birds called from branches, and humans too turned toward each other with new hunger. The thaw was not just of earth, but of skin and spirit. It was during this time that certain festivals were held, rites of fertility and renewal, drawn from ancient beliefs, half pagan and wholly alive. The most famous of these was the Disablot, a sacrifice and celebration in honor of the Disir, female spirits linked to fate, fertility, and protection. The women of the village took a central role in these rites, their bodies seen not as vessels of sin, but as portals of life and power. They would offer food, ale, and sometimes blood, whether from beasts or ritual cuts on their own palms, while chanting for strength in the coming season. In these sacred gatherings, men watched with reverence. The veil between the mortal and divine thinned, and desire shifted from the carnal to the sacred. A touch became more than a signal. It was a petition, an offering, an echo of the deep knowing that lay buried in the earth since before language. Couples might wander off from the fire into the fields, where the scent of damp grass mingled with sweat and breath. It was said that to conceive a child during Disablot was a blessing from the spirits, a child of the spring. Not all unions aimed to produce children, of course, but the fertility festivals created a space where intimacy could be claimed without shame, without the normal bindings of role and rank. The girl who milked goats might share herself with the Jarl's son, and for that night they would meet as equals beneath the moon. Come morning, the world resumed its order. But something lingered, a look, a blush, a secret woven into the days to follow. It was in spring, too, that marriages were most often arranged. With travel routes open and ships readying for summer voyages, families negotiated alliances and exchanged promises. Fathers spoke to fathers, mothers to mothers. The bride and groom were consulted last. This did not mean their desires were dismissed, but tradition held sway. A daughter could protest, even refuse, but only within reason. And a son, though freer, still bore the burden of expectation. The betrothal ceremony itself held deep symbolism. Hands were joined over swords, oaths spoken before kin and gods alike. A feast followed, where the couple sat side by side, and guests watched for any sign, any shift in posture, any fleeting touch that might hint at whether love would follow duty. For some it did. For others, it never would. And yet in both cases, the marriage would be consummated by the end of that night. This first night was less a private affair than a communal transition. While the actual joining happened behind a woven curtain or in a separate building, the couple's union was a matter of public interest. Sometimes the bed sheets were shown the next day, proof of virginity and legitimacy. Sometimes they were not. What mattered most was that the gods had heard their oaths and that flesh had answered. For the couple, this night was layered with emotion. Some were strangers, nervous and unsure. Others had grown up knowing each other, comforted by familiarity. A few had already been lovers in secret, now finally allowed to touch without fear. The rhythm of that first joining varied, awkward, joyful, tender, dutiful, but it marked the beginning of a new life, a turning from oneself into another. The following days were filled with small gestures of intimacy. A husband might bring his new wife a bowl of water in the morning, wash her feet, or braid her hair, a quiet show of humility. A wife might sew his name into the lining of his cloak, or prepare his favorite meal with her own hands. These offerings said, "I see you. I choose you. Let us begin." Spring also brought travelers, traders, and strangers to the settlements, each one carrying their own stories, desires, and charm. Among them were skalds, the poets and musicians who moved from hall to hall, sharing tales in exchange for food and shelter. Some were old, their voices cracked but still potent. Others were young and golden-tongued, weaving verses that stirred something inside their listeners. A skald could change the air in a room. His songs of longing, of battles and forbidden kisses, lit fires in hearts that had long been quiet. It was not unusual for a woman or a man to fall briefly, fiercely in love with one. These were fleeting romances, often ending with a whispered goodbye before dawn. But their intensity left marks deeper than many marriages. Years later, a woman might still recall the way his voice dipped at the final line of a verse, or the way his fingers lingered too long when handing her the harp. And what of those whose bodies did not fit the expected forms? The Viking world was not untouched by diversity. There were those born different, men who loved men, women who preferred women, or those who moved between roles like mist. Their stories were not always written down, but they existed, in side glances, in shared tasks that turned into shared beds, in the quiet understanding between two people that what they felt was not for others to name. Some were mocked, yes, others were feared, but many found ways to love, quietly, fiercely. The gods themselves blurred lines, Loki ever shifting, Odin who practiced the feminine art of satyr magic. In this world of flux and myth, the boundaries of desire were more fluid than law would admit. Spring, then, was not only a season of fertility, it was a time of rediscovery, of looking at one's partner anew, of remembering the warmth of skin after months wrapped in wool, of reaching for another not because of need, but because the air was soft and the earth was singing. And so beneath blossoming trees and beside streams swollen with meltwater, lovers lay again in the grass, as their ancestors had done and their children would do. The old woman in her hut might smile at their laughter, the skald might shape their names into song, and the gods above would nod, having seen it all before. The warmth of summer settled over the land like a blanket of honey, thick and golden and slow to lift. The days stretched longer than memory itself, and the nights, though shorter, glowed with the lingering breath of twilight. In this season, when life surged in every root and bird call, Viking hearts beat faster, not with war drums or the fear of famine, but with a quieter pulse, that of the flesh seeking closeness, of souls leaning toward one another like sunflowers. Fields rippled with barley, boats glided lazily across mirror-smooth fjords, and bodies, unburdened by furs, cloaks, and layers, moved freely. Skin kissed by sunlight became a new kind of language. Shoulders exposed at the river's edge, arms slick with sweat in the forge, necks arched back in laughter at market stalls. Everywhere the senses sharpened. People touched more, out of warmth, out of playfulness, out of the sheer joy of existing in a world no longer locked in frost. In the villages, tasks brought people together. Young men and women worked side by side in the fields, sharing tools, songs, and stories. There were games, races, wrestling matches, and archery contests. These weren't only sport, they were courtship. The way a girl moved as she drew a bow, the way a boy laughed when he was pinned in the grass, such moments did more than entertain. They invited notice, they invited longing. And then there were the rivers. The rivers were holy in summer, not just for drinking or washing, but for the rituals they seemed to demand. Groups of girls would gather to bathe, their laughter drifting like birdsong through the reeds. Boys, pretending to fish nearby, stole glances, or sometimes boldly joined, splashing in mock battles that turned into embraces when no one was looking. The river was a boundaryless place, a world within the world, where rules softened and bare feet stirred more than silk. Married couples, too, felt the stir of the season. The sun drew out old affections, reignited passions dimmed by winter's hardships. A wife might bring her husband mead in the shade of the barn and linger as he drank. A husband might wrap his arms around her waist as she kneaded dough, whispering something low that made her cheeks flush. Children napped in hammocks or played far from the house, giving parents space to reclaim one another without interruption. These small reunions, familiar and tender, were often more powerful than the grand declarations of youth. Summer was also the season of travel and trade, of movement and mingling. Foreigners arrived with skin darkened by distant suns, with languages heavy with unknown vowels, with eyes that carried stories of cities where towers touched clouds and markets stretched for days. With them came not only goods, but new ideas, new scents, spices, silks, and customs. And sometimes, with a single look, they brought desire. It wasn't uncommon for a foreign trader to find himself invited to a longhouse feast, where his foreignness was a kind of cloak, something both exotic and enticing. Women asked about lands beyond the mountains, about rivers wider than their own fjords. Men listened to tales of strange music and temples where lovers danced. In such exchanges, attraction sparked easily. And while not every flirtation led to a night shared, many did. These moments were not seen as betrayal, but as stories, chapters in the great human epic of curiosity and hunger. There were stories, too, of women who left. A girl, weary of her father's farm, might board a ship with a trader or a sailor, disappearing over the horizon toward the unknown. Some called it foolish, others called it brave, but many understood. The world was wide. Desire wasn't always rooted in the body. It was also a hunger for more. More sky, more names, more chances to become something different. Summer weddings were common for obvious reasons. The land was bountiful, the weather gentle, and spirits high. Entire villages turned out to celebrate. The bride would be adorned in linen and silver, her hair loose or braided with flowers. The groom, clean-shaven and cloaked in his best tunic, would offer her a sword, not for protection, but as a symbol of her new place in his home. She might respond with a key, signaling her stewardship of the household. And when they walked hand in hand to the feast, their paths strewn with herbs and petals, it wasn't just a union of people, it was a weaving of futures. That night, after the feasting and dancing, they would lie together beneath the stars, perhaps in a special tent or house built just for the occasion. The sounds of laughter and music might still echo, but around them, silence would settle like a second skin. For some, this was a night of nervous fumbling. For others, it was the culmination of long-held longing. But always, it was a beginning. Not just of shared life, but of shared dreams. Not all lovers in summer sought permanence. Some sought only a night, a moment, a relief from loneliness. Behind the woodshed, in the tall grass by the creek, between the haystacks. These trysts were as old as time and as secret as the wind. They were rarely condemned unless scandal followed. The line between freedom and shame was fine but clear. Be discreet, be respectful, leave no wounds behind. There was a story told in whispers of a married woman who met her lover every third night beneath the elder tree. They never spoke during the day. He never asked her to leave her home. She never promised more than her presence. And yet, for 2 summers, they met. Only when he left for the east and never returned did she cry. For 3 days and 3 nights, quietly, as she tended the goats. Her husband never asked why. In this way, Viking summers held space for many kinds of love. Bright and brief, long and loyal, forbidden, reckless, sweet. Each one fed by the sun, by the ease of movement, by the sheer sensuality of warmth after so many months of cold. And as the days began to shorten once more, and the first geese called overhead in their journey south, lovers held each other closer, knowing the fire would soon return to the hearth, knowing that in the long silence of the coming dark, it was these summer touches, the hand in the hair, the kiss in the barley, the whispered promise, that would carry them through. Autumn crept in softly, like an old friend returning from a long journey, unhurried, familiar, tinged with melancholy. The fields faded from green to gold, then to brown. Leaves fell like whispers across the worn paths, and the air sharpened with the scent of smoke and damp earth. In the Viking world, autumn was the season of gathering, of storing, of bracing. And it was also the season of remembering. Couples who had danced beneath the stars in summer now walked closer together, their steps slower, more deliberate. Affection no longer burst like fireworks. It smoldered, deep and warm and low. It curled into the corners of the longhouse, into shared blankets, into the way 2 people looked at each other across a supper of dried fish and root vegetables. Love in autumn was not about hunger. It was about harvest. The grain was in. The animals were being slaughtered and preserved. The time for running through fields had passed. Now came the time of repair, of the roof, of the fence, of the soul. For many, autumn meant coming home, in every sense. Men returned from raids and trade routes, heavy with silver or grief. Women wrapped their arms around necks that had grown leaner, eyes that had seen too much. There were reunions filled with laughter and others lined with quiet disappointment. Not every return was joyous. Not every absence had been mourned. Some men came back to find their children taller. Their wives changed. Some women welcomed their husbands only out of duty, their hearts already hardened or turned elsewhere. These moments were complicated, layered with emotions that had no names, and yet they were lived. The fire still had to be lit, the bread still had to be baked, the bed shared. The longhouses grew more crowded as the cold crept in. Privacy vanished. Walls echoed with coughs and crying babies and the endless shuffle of boots. And so, intimacy in autumn became subtler, cloaked in ritual and rhythm. A wife might wake early to warm her husband's boots by the fire before he stirred. A husband might bring her a handful of berries, rare and late in season, found by chance during a morning hunt. These small acts said, "I see you, I remember." Marriages tested by absence were tested again by closeness. Some failed. A man used to freedom might chafe at the confines of family. A woman who had ruled her house alone might resist ceding control. Arguments simmered, old wounds reopened. But sometimes, more often than not, love endured. Not because it was easy, but because it was chosen again, day by day, in the quiet hours when no one was watching. And what of those who had no spouse waiting? The widows, the unmarried, the newly grown? For them, autumn was a time of possibility and danger. With the nights lengthening and the feasting season approaching, there was both opportunity and risk in every shadow. A glance across the mead hall, a hand that lingered too long, an invitation to share warmth just for the night. The line between comfort and consequence was easily blurred. One of the most solemn festivals of the season was Alphablatt, the elven sacrifice. Unlike the large public rites of spring and summer, this was a private, family-based observance. It was held in honor of the ancestors, and it was women who presided. During Alphablatt, the spirits of the dead were invited back into the home, offered food, drink, and remembrance. It was a quiet affair, filled with reverence and a sense of presence. And for many, it stirred old feelings. A widow might speak aloud to the husband she'd lost, her hands folded in her lap, her voice breaking only slightly. A man might light a candle for the wife who had died in childbirth and drink alone in the corner where she once sat. These remembrances weren't always sad. Sometimes they were comforting. Sometimes they sparked new bonds between those who grieved beside each other. There is a tale, told in low voices, of two people brought together during Alphablatt. He was a warrior recently returned, bearing a limp and a haunted silence. She was a widow, young, still in black. They sat across the fire from each other for many nights, saying little, watching the flames. Until one night, as the others drifted to sleep, he reached for her hand, not out of lust, but need. She didn't pull away. They became lovers that winter, not loudly, not proudly, but tenderly, slowly. They mended each other the way one mends wool, stitch by stitch, patience over passion. And when spring came, they married, not with fanfare, but with peace. In these quieter unions, love was no less fierce. It simply grew differently, like a tree twisted by wind but strong at the root. There were, of course, those whose love turned bitter in autumn. Lovers spurned, promises broken. Jealousy flared more easily in the close quarters of the cooling season. A man might see his wife smile too brightly at another. A woman might notice her husband's gaze drifting. Words once sweet became barbed. And in the claustrophobic dark of the approaching winter, some hearts broke clean, others cracked slowly. And still, despite the tensions, the longing remained. Bodies still ached for touch. Hands still searched in the night. People still reached for warmth, not just of body, but of soul. A whispered apology, a shared memory, a kiss placed on a temple instead of lips. These were the ways love survived the turning leaves. Autumn was a reckoning, of harvests gained and lost, of choices made in summer's heat now cooled by time. It was the season when lovers saw each other clearly, not through the haze of longing, but through the lens of what had been lived. And for those who could accept what they saw without illusion, without regret, there was something deeper than passion. There was companionship, that rarest kind of love, the kind that could stand beside the fire as the first snow fell and say without fear, "I am still here." The first snow fell in silence. No trumpets of wind, no thunder from the sky, just a gentle hush that settled over the land like a secret. The fields lay still, the animals tucked close, and even the rivers seemed to sleep beneath their new blanket. Winter had arrived, not as a storm, but as a soft final breath, and with it came a slow turning inward, not just of the world, but of the people. In the Viking longhouse, space grew tighter, the walls thick with smoke, the air steeped in the scent of stew, pine, sweat, and slow-burning peat. Outside, the landscape was pale and still. Inside, life concentrated like a flame, flickering in every whispered word and every shared touch. Winter was the season of closeness. It demanded it. There was nowhere else to go, no task urgent enough to draw one out into the frost unless survival required it. And so bodies lingered near each other. Conversations stretched long, fingers brushed as bowls passed between them, and lovers learned to speak in silence. There is a particular kind of intimacy that blooms when the world narrows. When two people lie beneath layers of fur, hearing only each other's breath, knowing the night is long and the dark is deeper than any summer shadow. In that space, even a glance held the weight of a promise. Even a sigh could carry a confession. New relationships often began in winter. It seems unlikely, yet it was so. A man and woman who had spent months side by side, their interactions brief and routine, might one day find their fingers touching a moment too long as they reached for the same pot. Their eyes might meet and not look away. Nothing was said, but everything shifted. That night, in the quiet, their beds felt colder than usual. The next night, one of them moved closer. The next, closer still. Not all of these unions were physical. Some were emotional, a quiet understanding, a partnership formed in shared tasks and mirrored exhaustion. Two people weaving together, not with their bodies, but with their habits. She would mend his socks without being asked. He would take her turn watching the goats. These gestures weren't romantic in the way poems sing. They were more sacred than that. They were the stitching of one life into another. Still, flesh hungered in the cold. The body knew how to ask for warmth, and sometimes it found it in familiar arms, sometimes in unexpected ones. A man widowed in the spring might find comfort in the presence of his late wife's sister. A young girl on the verge of womanhood might seek solace from an older thrall who treated her with quiet gentleness. The rules of the village remained, but winter bent them slightly, enough for desire to slip through. And then there were the dreams. The long nights bred dreams like moss on wet stone. People dreamed of old lovers, of past touches, of moments lost to time. A woman might wake with tears on her cheeks, not from sorrow, but from the echo of something once beautiful. A man might wake aroused and alone, confused by the vivid memory of a girl he hadn't thought of in years. Dreams in winter were not just dreams, they were visitations. Some said the spirits walked more freely when the snow muffled the world. Ancestors, old flames, longings too strong to die. In some homes, it was tradition to speak of these dreams, not in public but privately by the fire, over morning porridge or while darning wool. I dreamed of him again, a woman might say, her voice low. He stood outside, not saying a word, just watching. And the listener would nod, not asking more, because they understood. They too had dreamed. Children especially were born in winter, not conceived. Usually that was for spring and summer, but born when the cold wrapped the world in stillness. Their cries pierced the hush like bird calls, and in their birth, lovers became parents once more. The midwife would whisper old blessings, rub the mother's back with warm oil, and place the infant into waiting arms as if passing fire from hand to hand. And in the shadows, the father, or sometimes the lover, would watch with awe and terror and something deeper than either. Jealousy, too, had a way of rising in winter. In the tightness of the longhouse, secrets were harder to keep. A misplaced glance, a late return, a subtle shift in affection, all became visible. Arguments erupted not in the fields but beside the hearth. Accusations whispered behind hands or hissed in frustration over washing buckets. Suspicion was a bitter spice, and winter had no shortage of it. But love survived. It always did. Old couples, weathered and quiet, would share a blanket and hum songs from their youth. Young lovers, newly bound, would trace the patterns on each other's skin and speak of dreams they'd yet to follow. Even those who had no one found comfort in routine, in ritual, in the knowing that they belonged to a place, a people, a rhythm older than sorrow. In winter, the sagas were told, and those stories were filled with longing. Gods who fell in love with mortals, warriors who kissed their beloved before battle, wives who waited a decade for their husband's return. Each tale wrapped the listeners in warmth, reminding them that their own desires were part of something ancient and noble. And when the snow deepened and the ice thickened on the lakes, people pressed closer still, 2 by 2, sometimes 3, sometimes alone, but dreaming, always dreaming. because winter did not still the heart, it revealed it. Layer by layer, word by word, breath by breath, until all that remained was the truth beneath, the human ache to be known and held and remembered. Winter in the Viking world was not measured by dates or calendars. It was felt in the bones. The cold settled into the marrow, slow and insistent, turning joints stiff and breath visible. The sun barely climbed above the horizon, casting a weak silver light that did little to warm the skin. And so within the walls of the longhouse, people built a different kind of fire, not just of wood and flame, but of story, touch, memory, and desire. In the absence of the world outside, they turned to each other, again and again. Among the most intimate customs of winter was the sharing of beds. This was not always sexual, nor even romantic. It was simply practical and deeply human. To share body heat was to share survival. Young and old, kin and sometimes not, lay close beneath layers of fur and woven wool. The nights were long, sometimes endless, and in those endless hours a hand might reach, not out of lust, but need. A whisper might be answered, a silence might be filled. There was an understanding among the Norse. Bodies needed warmth, but hearts needed kindness. When these overlapped, something sacred was born. Some of the most lasting loves began not with passion, but with familiarity. Two people who slept side by side night after night, their bodies learning the language of each other without words. The curve of a back, the rhythm of breath, the softness of skin at the nape of the neck. Over time, these sensations became necessary, like air. And one morning, perhaps over shared bread or while watching the snowfall, they realized they were no longer simply surviving together. They were loving. The hearth became the center of this quiet intimacy. Women rose early to tend it, their movements slow and steady. Men brought in wood, their arms full and red from cold. Children were bundled nearby, sleepy and warm. Around the hearth, stories were told, not just of gods and giants, but of real people. Lovers long gone, aunts who ran away with sailors, brothers who married girls from far-off shores. These tales were shared like bread, passed from mouth to mouth, filling and sustaining. There was one such story, told often and with different names depending on the village. A man, cursed with silence, who fell in love with a weaver. He watched her each day, never speaking, only listening to the sound of her loom. One winter night, he left a carved brooch on her bench. She said nothing, but wore it the next day. That evening she sat beside him for the first time. They never spoke, but they were never apart again. Such stories were not rare. They were the quiet epic of daily life. Of course, not all moments were tender. The long nights could also bring restlessness, even despair. With so little sunlight, some fell into dark moods. They grew impatient, suspicious, distant, and when the pressure of closeness became too much, it cracked. Lovers argued in low voices, trust frayed like old thread. Sometimes one would rise in the night and walk outside, barefoot in the snow, just to remember what it felt like to be alone. Sometimes they came back, sometimes they didn't. The community, close-knit as it was, noticed everything. A change in routine, a seat left empty, a silence where laughter once lived. And yet they rarely interfered. There was a quiet respect for the privacy of the heart. What happened between two people beneath fur and shadow was not for others to judge. Even in marriages, boundaries were understood to shift. A man who had taken a lover in the summer might return to his wife in the winter, not out of guilt but gravity. A woman whose heart had wandered might still lay beside her husband, her hand resting on his chest as if to say, I am still yours, even if not all of me. These truths were not spoken but felt, and often that was enough. Among the unmarried, winter was a time of secrets. The longhouse held many corners, many shadows. A look across the fire could lead to a shared pelt before morning. These unions were quiet but not shameful. They were accepted as part of life. As long as they caused no harm, they were allowed to flicker and fade like candlelight. There were rituals too, small private ones. A girl might stitch her beloved's name into the hem of her tunic. A boy might braid a strand of her hair into his wrist binding. Runes were carved into beams above beds. Charms tucked beneath pillows. Herbs hung from rafters not just for protection, but to draw affection. The language of love was layered, encoded in gesture and symbol. Even children felt its presence, not in the adult way, of course, but in how they watched. They noticed who brought food to whom, who sat close, who sang the same songs at night. And in the games they played, marriage games, bride games, they mimicked what they saw, learning the rhythm of closeness long before they understood it. One of the most beloved traditions came near the solstice, the longest night. A feast was held, with more light than usual. Candles, torches, the hearth roaring high. People wore their best, shared their stores, told their boldest tales. But after the feast, once the fire dimmed, there was a silence, not of exhaustion, but of reverence. In that silence, it was said, the gods listened most closely. And so, lovers would make their truest confessions, not aloud, but in the way they touched each other's hands, the way they looked into each other's eyes. Promises were made then, unspoken, but strong as iron. And perhaps that was the lesson of winter, that intimacy was not always loud, that love, real love, didn't need grand gestures or shouted declarations. It could be found in the quiet gift of presence, in the patience of a shared blanket, in the steadiness of breath beside breath, when the wind howled outside and nothing else in the world mattered. For in the depth of winter, when the cold was thickest and the night most long, to love was to survive, and to be loved, truly loved, was to be warm, no matter the weather. As the winter deepened and the world outside grew silent beneath layers of snow, time itself seemed to bend. Days passed without distinction, the sky staying dim from morning to dusk, and the routines within the longhouse began to feel like tides, rising and falling with the rhythm of firewood, food, and the human need for touch. It was during these middle months, the hardest, coldest stretch, when the walls closed in just enough to make every word count. In this hush, intimacy became even more delicate. It no longer danced, it settled, became a slow, steady flame that warmed from within. And in this inward season, desire found a new shape, not urgent, not fiery, but enduring, a heat held like an ember in the palm. In many homes, love was sustained not by novelty, but by repetition. A wife who brought her husband a carved bowl of broth, her thumb lingering on the rim just long enough for him to notice. A husband who quietly mended his wife's boots with the same care he would use to sharpen his sword. These were not grand gestures, but they were profound. For in a time when survival itself was a daily effort, choosing to be gentle was an act of reverence. There were fewer new courtships now, fewer moments of discovery. Most who had been bound in summer or autumn had now entered the deeper work of knowing, of seeing each other fully, without the gloss of flirtation or the thrill of anticipation. And this knowing could be frightening. It peeled back illusions, it revealed weaknesses, but it also allowed a richer kind of closeness, one built not only on desire, but on resilience. In these long nights, lovers learned the topography of each other's minds. They spoke in the dark, about dreams, fears, memories they had never voiced before. There, wrapped in wool and fur, shielded from the world, truths flowed more easily. A woman might confess that she missed her mother's voice. A man might speak of a brother lost at sea. And in response, there would not always be words. Sometimes just the movement of arms around a shaking frame. Sometimes just the warmth of breath at the base of a neck. There were also moments of playfulness. Laughter did not leave the longhouse in winter. It simply changed shape. A game played with carved bone pieces. A teasing remark passed across the cook fire. A sudden snowball, lobbed through the open door, met with mock outrage and chasing footsteps. Joy did not disappear in the cold. It was simply savored more carefully, like the last jar of honey or the soft skin of a lover's shoulder. Older couples were often the silent center of these scenes. Not the loudest, not the most demonstrative, but steady as stone. They moved around each other like stars in orbit. She would hand him his cloak before he asked. He would refill her cup before she finished. Theirs was a love less seen than felt, woven into every shared silence, every knowing glance. And the younger ones watched, quietly hoping that time would do the same for them. Yet not all was peaceful. Long winters could fracture what warmer seasons had built. Small irritations grew large. Jealousies, once buried, found breath in the stillness. A man whose wife seemed distant might wonder who she dreamed of. A woman whose husband drank too often might begin to dread his closeness at night. There were arguments muffled behind thick curtains. There were tears hidden in the washroom. There were moments when the fire did not seem enough. And sometimes, rarely but enough to be remembered, a love ended. Not in fire or fury, but in a kind of surrender. Two people who no longer saw each other, who no longer tried to be kind. They continued their duties, shared meals, slept side by side. But the thread that once bound them had frayed too far, and in its place there was only habit. The village noticed, but said little. It was not their place. Love was private, even when it faded. But winter also had a way of healing things, of slowing time just enough to allow repair. A husband who had once spoken cruelly might bring his wife a garland made of dried flowers saved from autumn. A wife who had turned away might reach for his hand during the evening prayers. Sometimes that was all it took. Not to undo what had been, but to begin again. There were stories of such turnings. Of a man who wrote a poem for his wife after a season of silence. He could not speak the words aloud, his pride was too great, but he carved them into wood and left them at her place by the fire. She read them as she stirred the pot, tears falling into the stew. That night, they touched each other with the softness of first love, though they had been together 20 winters. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Wolves howled in the distance. The world remained frozen. But inside, bodies pressed close, and the heat of shared breath was enough to hold off the dark, enough to make it to spring. Deep in the heart of winter, when the days blurred into one another, and the longhouse walls whispered with the creak of timber and muffled voices, stories took on a different weight. Not just entertainment, but guidance, memory, instruction passed down in the lull between chores, in the hush after supper, in the hush before sleep. It was during these dark weeks that stories of sacred intimacy surfaced. Tales not just of lovers and longing, but of divine union, of ancient rites older than names, of sex as ritual, as offering, as something greater than the body alone. These stories were not always spoken in the great hall or before a roaring crowd. They came from the mouths of elders, mostly women, in the quiet spaces, while grinding grain, braiding hair, or preparing tinctures in the herb room. One of the oldest of these tales was of Freya, not the fierce battlefield goddess many knew, but Freyja the lover, Freya the mourner, Freya, who wandered the 9 worlds in search of her lost husband, weeping tears of red gold. In some versions, she lay with kings and craftsmen along the way, not for comfort, but for knowledge, for magic, for the power of bodies joined in sacred exchange. She was not shamed for this. She was revered. In her name, rituals were once performed in the depth of winter, ceremonies whispered to have taken place in sacred groves, buried now beneath layers of snow and time. Women danced barefoot, despite the cold, their hair unbound, their breath rising in steam. Men watched in silence, not as masters or judges, but as witnesses. The dance was not for them. It was for the land, for fertility, for balance, for the goddess. It was said that during these rites, a woman might choose a partner, not for life, not even for a season, but for a night. And no one would speak against her, for to join in love in Freya's name was to bless the fields, the herds, the very future of the people. These old ways did not survive unchanged. In time, as Christianity crept in along the trade routes and settled into the corners of belief, the stories were softened, retold, hidden, but traces of them lingered. In the way girls wore their hair loose on certain days, in the herbs burned during childbirth, in the silence held when speaking of desire, the people still knew. And in the privacy of their own homes, some couples shaped their own rituals. Not grand, not public, but sacred in their own right. A woman might light a small lamp before bed, scented with oil pressed from the last of the summer's herbs. Her husband would know tonight was not routine. It was invitation. They would lie together slowly, not just in pursuit of pleasure, but in reverence for what it meant to still be alive, to still be warm, to still have each other. Sometimes afterward, they would not speak. Just hold hands beneath the firs, their fingers twined like roots in deep soil. Among younger couples, these moments could feel like discovery. The first time a girl saw the face of her lover lit by firelight, not moonlight, not ale-hazed dusk, but fully awake, bare, unguarded. The first time a boy heard his name spoken not with urgency, but with gentleness. These initiations weren't marked by ceremony, but by memory. Etched so deeply into the self that decades later, in another winter, they would still return in dreams. There was one story, half legend, half truth, of a man who had been celibate for 10 years after his wife died in childbirth. He raised their 2 children, worked the land, and spoke little. One winter, a widow came to live nearby. She was not young. Her hair was already streaked with gray, her hands strong from weaving. They met often in passing, shared salted meat, exchanged tools, nothing more. Until one night, during a blizzard that buried the village for 3 days, she appeared at his door, soaked and shivering. He let her in, gave her his dry cloak, made space beside the fire. They did not speak much, but that night, for the first time in a decade, he touched another's skin, slowly, carefully, as if learning again how to be alive. And she too opened herself, not to a new beginning, but to a long-delayed return to warmth. In the days that followed, they said nothing of it. There were no vows, no declarations, but every night thereafter she returned, and he always waited. The village knew, of course, but no one asked. No one needed to. There was a quiet kind of respect for love that found its way through snow and silence. Even among those who did not have a lover, winter offered its own kind of intimacy. A woman might care for an elder, washing their feet and rubbing balm into cracked heels. A man might teach a boy how to shape arrowheads, their hands working close, breath visible in the cold air. These too were acts of closeness, not sexual, but no less sacred. And sometimes when loneliness pressed too heavy, people sought comfort in themselves, not in desperation, but in understanding. A quiet night alone, a touch that needed no witness. The Vikings did not shame this. It was seen as part of the natural world, a cycle of desire and satisfaction, no different than hunger or thirst. When spring was still only a promise, hidden beneath the frost-hardened earth, people carried this warmth within them, in memory, in story, in body. For even in the coldest season, when nothing seemed to grow, intimacy endured, hidden in plain sight, sacred as fire, quiet as breath, waiting, always waiting. When the first cracks of thaw began to form along the edges of the river, it was not sound that marked the change, but scent, a faint sweetness in the air, damp soil rising from beneath the melting snow, the scent of old leaves beginning to rot, of moss beginning to wake. It was subtle, almost nothing. But the people knew. The land was stirring. In the longhouses, the fires burned a little lower. Doors were opened for a few minutes each morning to let the staleness out. People blinked into the pale light as if re-emerging from a dream. And within their bodies, something stirred too. A faint tension in the chest, a restlessness in the legs, a familiar ache that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with touch. Spring had not yet arrived, but it had announced itself. For lovers, it was the season of remembering. The winter had dulled much, skin, instinct, hunger. But now, with the turning of the air, came renewal. A kiss that had grown familiar felt suddenly new. A hand resting on a hip lingered longer. Eyes met again across crowded rooms, not in routine, but recognition. And among those who had not touched anyone in many months, a deeper hunger emerged, not only for pleasure, but for connection. To be seen again, to be known again, as though the self had gone dormant with the snow and was now waking slowly, stretching beneath the ribs. There was a tradition among some villages, practiced during these earliest days of thaw. Women would sweep the thresholds of their homes with bundled birch, not to clean away dirt, but to signal that they were open to visitors, open to new stories, new bonds, new beginnings. The sweep was a symbol, and the men who noticed might pass by more slowly, tip their heads, offer small gestures of interest, a carved token, a song, a quiet conversation as they helped with firewood. It was not bold. Nothing in this season was yet bold. Everything moved gently, as if not to scare the new warmth away. The youngest members of the village, newly come of age, felt this pull most sharply. Boys who had spent winter with their hands calloused from chopping wood now watched the girls with fresh eyes, uncertain and eager. Girls who had sat silent through many evenings now laughed more freely, braided flowers into their hair, lingered longer near the boys whose eyes met theirs. Their courtships were awkward and sweet, gifts exchanged, paths walked together, conversations about nothing that meant everything. And sometimes one pair would slip away, into the woods, to the river's edge, or behind the still dormant garden beds. There, beneath bare branches, they might share a kiss, or more. The elders watched with knowing eyes. Some smiled, remembering. Others frowned, protective and cautious, but all understood. The world was waking, and so were its people. Among older couples, the season brought reflection. For some, it was the time to revisit long-held bonds with fresh tenderness. A husband might notice, truly notice, his wife's hands again, the way they moved through wool, the softness at the wrist. A wife might see the lines in her husband's face deepened by another winter and feel both sadness and devotion rise in equal measure. In some households, lovemaking resumed after a long silence, not in urgency, but in gratitude for making it through, for still being here, together. And in that reunion, there was something solemn, as if each touch reaffirmed not just the bond, but life itself. Other households carried scars into spring, harsh words spoken in the dark of winter, absences that could not be explained, silences that had settled like dust. In those homes, the thaw brought discomfort, a surfacing of feelings too long buried. But even this was a kind of intimacy, the willingness to face what had been ignored, to choose whether to mend or to part. There were also those who stood at the edge of change. A widow who had been silent all winter might begin wearing color again, just a little, a red thread at her cuff. A man who had lived alone for many years might begin visiting the market more often, lingering near one particular stall. These small acts, barely visible to the outside world, were declarations. I am still here. I still want. I am still becoming. The land echoed their sentiment. Ice cracked loudly like a drumbeat beneath the rivers. The ground softened enough to leave footprints. Crows returned to the trees and called across empty fields. And lovers, whether old or new, answered in their own way. They wrote poems on bark, left offerings of dried apples beneath their beloved's pillow, whispered names into the wind to see if the wind would carry them. One legend told of a woman who waited each winter for her love to return from the sea, and each spring she planted a single flower atop a stone by the shore. If it bloomed before the solstice, he would come home. If it didn't, she would light a candle every night until autumn. And whether or not he came, she never missed a spring without planting that flower. Some said it was superstition. Others said it was faith. Perhaps, in truth, it was both. For in the time between frost and flower, everything felt suspended, full of potential, fragile as breath. And in that quiet, every touch, every look, every shared cup of warm mead felt like a choice. To begin again, to trust the sun would return, to remember that even after the deepest silence, the heart still knew how to sing. When spring at last stepped fully into the world, it did not shout its arrival. It came with slow assurance, persistent rain, green shoots pushing through black earth, the bleating of newborn lambs, and the wind carrying warmth instead of warning. The snow that had blanketed the land was now only a memory in the shaded corners of hills. Water rushed through brooks swollen from melt, and the longhouse, once dim and thick with smoke, now breathed light through its open doors. People moved differently now. They walked with looser limbs, their faces lifted more often to the sun. Their clothing grew lighter, their voices louder. Laughter returned to the courtyards, to the edges of fields, to the banks of rivers where children played barefoot in the shallows. The world was becoming itself again, and so were the people. In this new warmth, intimacy no longer needed hiding. It stepped out into daylight. Young lovers were easiest to see, their passion fresh and eager. They met behind sheds, under blooming trees, in clearings just beyond the village paths. But there was no shame in it. If an elder passed and caught a glimpse of a couple walking hand in hand, or sharing a kiss behind a haystack, they might shake their head. But more often than not, they smiled. For spring belonged to the bold, and love in bloom was seen as a blessing, not a scandal. This was the season of betrothals. Fathers walked together again, speaking of dowries and shared grazing land. Mothers consulted the signs, weather, dreams, omens in the firelight, to choose favorable dates. The girls whose hands had turned red from weaving wedding linen now embroidered them with symbols of fertility: birds, spirals, twin serpents. The boys, puffed with a sudden urgency to become men, practiced their sword work, carved gifts from bone and wood, and rehearsed the words they would speak when the time came. Some arranged unions were met with quiet joy. Two people who had grown fond over time, now allowed to name that fondness for what it was. Others held more tension. There were couples whose paths had not crossed until the decision was made. They sat together awkwardly at feasts, stole glances that said little, and wondered what it might mean to share a life with a stranger. But even in those hesitant beginnings, tenderness could grow. A girl might find that the boy chosen for her sang while chopping wood, and that the song stayed in her head long after. A boy might discover that his intended bride laughed with her whole face unguarded, and that this laughter stirred something in him that swordplay never had. Marriage in the Viking world was both sacred and strategic. It was a knot tied not just between two people, but between families, clans, and fates. Yet within this larger framework, room still existed for desire. And for those lucky enough to find both, desire and duty aligned, there was no sweeter fortune. Rituals preceded the union. There were blessings made over the household gods, offerings laid at the foot of trees believed to be sacred. The bride would often be bathed by her women, scrubbed with herbs and brushed until her skin gleamed. It was said that Freya watched over this rite, and that a soft chant, carried down through generations, must be sung to ensure the fertility of the womb and the harmony of the marriage. The groom, meanwhile, would spend the day before in quiet preparation. In some traditions, he fasted. In others, he hunted a small animal and offered its blood to the spirits of his ancestors. His sword, if he carried one, was polished and laid at the threshold of the bridal chamber, not as a threat, but a symbol of protection, of honor, of the bond he would now defend with his life. The wedding night was not always a moment of passion. Sometimes it was a careful dance. Two strangers, or near strangers, lying beside each other with hearts beating fast and questions unspoken. There was shyness, there was sometimes awkwardness, and always there was the weight of expectation. But in the soft candlelight, in the hush of the longhouse now emptied of guests and laughter, a different kind of connection often began. Hands touched with caution, breath synchronized without instruction. Words, if spoken, were few and quiet. There were couples who made love on that first night with hunger, others who simply held each other and waited for morning. What mattered most was not the act itself, but the beginning. A joining not just of bodies, but of stories. And yet not all intimacy in spring was tied to marriage. Some desires flared and faded with the blooming of the meadows. A traveling skald, lingering longer than necessary in one household, might find a willing companion in a farmer's daughter or a lonely widow. These encounters, brief as they were, held their own kind of beauty. They were not promises. They were not obligations. They were moments of shared breath, warmth passed between strangers who might never see each other again. Even those long bound in marriage sometimes rediscovered each other. A husband, watching his wife pin up her hair in the morning light, might feel a pull he had not felt in years. A wife, noticing the new line at the corner of her husband's eye, might see in it the history they'd built together and feel a tenderness deeper than desire. In spring, love was not just a fire, it was a garden, and gardens required tending. So people reached for one another. They brought small gifts, early berries, feathers, smooth stones warmed by sun. They whispered at night, not always secrets, but simple things. How the bees had returned, how the soil smelled rich, how the dreams had changed. They held each other beneath open windows now, not hidden by fur and darkness, but visible. The village saw and did not turn away, because in the season of bloom all things softened, even the most weathered hearts, even the most guarded ones. And so as the trees unfurled their leaves, so did the people, slowly, boldly, with joy, with longing, with the memory of every touch that had carried them through the cold, and with hope for every touch still to come. By the time spring ripened into full bloom, the world had changed its texture entirely. What had once been hard and gray now shimmered in greens and golds, and the air once dry and brittle turned soft with damp earth and open sky. The people moved through it as if waking from a long dream, shoulders loosened, eyes clearer. They lingered outdoors longer. They walked without cloaks. They spoke with laughter again. And underneath all this brightness, intimacy swelled, not as a secret, but as a song humming just below the surface of things. Among the birthing animals and sprouting crops, love too birthed itself again. In this season, young love often turned into something more. What had begun as glances and whispered names grew roots. The games played behind the barn or beside the river gave way to something steadier. Two people now sat together at meals, shared tasks in the fields, touched more often, even in public. These affections weren't concealed anymore. They were claimed, not with pride exactly, but with an ease born of certainty. Parents took notice, siblings teased, elders watched with one part amusement and one part worry. Because love, though beautiful, was not always safe. It made people reckless, it made people brave. And in this age of shifting seasons, such courage was both admired and feared. There was one tale told again and again, with different names but the same shape. A boy and a girl, promised to others by their families, who met beneath the great ash tree at dusk. They never spoke their love aloud, but the way they stood close, the way their hands brushed, made it undeniable. And when their marriages came near, they vanished. Some said they drowned themselves. Others said they fled far north where the fjords held new villages and no one knew their names. And some, especially the old women, said they became the wind that rustled the ash tree each year at this time, reminding everyone that not all love fits within the lines drawn for it. Not all love ended in tragedy, of course. Many found peace in unions both arranged and chosen. Marriages bloomed in this season with festivals, feasting, and nights thick with song. Garlands hung over doorways, mead flowed, old feuds were set aside if only briefly, and the newly joined couples disappeared for their wedding nights, not into silence, but into whispers and candlelight. The long houses were filled with a kind of gentle expectancy, as if everyone waited to see if love would take hold like seed in good soil. Those already long married found new ways to see one another. A husband might carve a comb for his wife, even though she already had one. A wife might mend her husband's tunic, not just with thread, but with runes of protection sewn into the seams. These were not declarations, they were reminders. I see you still. I choose you still. The older couples, those who had seen many springs together, became quieter in their affections, but no less deep. You could tell if you looked. In the way she refilled his cup before he noticed it was empty. In the way he stood slightly behind her when strangers were near, close enough to protect, but never to control. Their love was not made of fire anymore. It was made of coals, slow, warm, steady. There were those, too, who found love later in life. A widower and a widow, once friends, now beginning to linger longer when speaking, sharing more meals, taking more walks. One day she began combing his hair without being asked. One day he began leaving half of his bread for her. No announcement was made. No feast was held. But they began sleeping side by side, and no one questioned it. Love, after all, needed no permission. Spring was also a time of awakening for those whose desires had never fit the expected form. A man who loved another man might find the courage to speak it aloud beneath the stars. A woman who had always felt different might finally reach for the hand of someone who had always watched her too long to pretend it was nothing. These loves were quiet, mostly. Not always hidden, but protected. Not everyone accepted them, but some did. And in the gentle stretch of spring, when everything leaned toward life, even these forbidden affections found a place to grow. Among the celebrations of the season was a rite called Varblot, held in honor of Var, the goddess of promises. Couples would speak their private oaths to each other beneath open sky, vows not written, not witnessed, but sacred all the same. These might be lovers pledging secrecy, betrothed partners swearing fidelity, or married couples renewing their bond. The only rule was this: once the promise was made, it belonged to the goddess. Breaking it would call her judgment. The ritual was quiet, often held in groves or near water. A simple clasping of hands, a shared breath, a touch to the forehead, to the heart. Some said they felt Var's presence in the breeze, others in the silence that followed. But all agreed there was power in speaking love aloud to no one but the gods. Afterward, the couples returned home different somehow, not visibly changed, but woven tighter together. It wasn't always bliss, but it was deeper, more anchored, more known. There were also losses in this season. Not every love survived the thaw. The warmth revealed things hidden in winter's quiet. A heart turned cold, a promise broken, a longing unreturned. Some parted gently, others not. And in those moments, even the brightest green could seem cruel. But spring had room for sorrow too. It softened it, let it be seen, then held. And in time, even those with aching hearts found new rhythms, a new voice at the feast, a new face at the riverbank, a new silence that did not hurt as much as it did before. For love, like the earth, always finds a way back, even after the deepest freeze, even after the longest silence, even when we forget what warmth feels like. Spring remembers and teaches us to remember too. By late spring, the world was loud again. The trees had dressed themselves fully, thick with leaves that whispered and shimmered in the breeze. Birds nested and sang at every hour, their melodies blending with the soft bleating of young goats, the hammer of hooves in damp soil, the voices of children running barefoot through wildflowers. Even the river spoke louder now, no longer hushed beneath ice but tumbling with renewed purpose, swollen and joyful. Life had returned completely, and so had desire. In this full bloom of the season, intimacy stretched beyond the private. It wove itself into the fabric of daily life, not just in kisses stolen in the tall grass, but in the way hands brushed while planting together, in the shared drink from a horn passed between two mouths, in the way laughter lingered between two people longer than necessary. This was the time of feasts. As the first successful sowings were completed and the animals fattened on new grazing, villages gathered to celebrate. These weren't the grand harvest festivals of autumn, nor the solemn blaughts of winter. These were gatherings of joy, of music, of flesh. On feast nights, the longhouse transformed. Tables groaned beneath platters of fresh bread, smoked fish, and early berries. Jugs of mead were passed without measure. The walls echoed with clapping, singing, and the thump of dancers' feet. Light spilled from the doors and windows, calling even the shyest souls from their corners. In this energy, boundaries softened, eyes wandered, conversation grew bold. A look held too long became a signal. A song sung too close to someone's ear became a whisper meant only for them. The Norse did not see desire as something to be hidden. It was a part of being alive, like hunger, like song. And the feasts allowed space for it. Not recklessly, but freely. There was a custom at such feasts, found in many villages, the sharing of stories between lovers, but not their own stories. They would sit beside each other and take turns telling a tale, sometimes a myth, sometimes a memory, sometimes a dream. The goal was not to impress, it was to reveal something of the self, even if disguised in fiction. A young man might tell a tale of a wolf who wandered alone until it heard a girl singing in the forest. A girl might share a story of a swan who refused to leave the lake until someone brought her a flower grown only in winter. The stories, whether clumsy or poetic, opened doors that ordinary words could not. And sometimes, once the candles burned low, those lovers would slip away. Not in secret, but not with spectacle either. Just quietly, hand in hand, stepping into the night while the music continued behind them. They might walk to the river or into the trees or simply to a corner of the field where no one would follow. There, in the dark hum of crickets and the soft rustling of grass, they would lay together. Not all of these unions were new. Some had shared a dozen nights before. Some had even pledged oaths. But in this fullness of the season, each meeting felt new again. The air itself carried a kind of sweetness, a density of scent and sound that made every touch more vivid. Skin on skin in spring was different. It wasn't desperate, as in winter, nor curious, as in autumn. It was lush, rooted. A joining of bodies in celebration of having made it through the cold. A tribute to warmth and light and survival. Among married couples, this time was often a quiet renewal. The weight of winter had been shed, the first labor of spring completed. Now, they had space to breathe again. A wife might surprise her husband with a ribbon in her hair, the same color she wore when they first met. A husband might gather wildflowers for her without saying why, and place them on her stool before she woke. They didn't need grand gestures, just gestures. Enough to say, I still see you, still want you. Sometimes couples who had grown distant found one another again in the strange magic of a feast night. Music softened pride, laughter blurred memory, and with one accidental brush of fingers, something was remembered. They might not speak of it then, but later, when the hall was empty and the children slept, they would find their way back to each other, not with words, but with hands and breath and time. But not all intimacy was romantic. In spring, touch was exchanged more freely among friends, neighbors, kin. Women braided each other's hair, pressed shoulders together while washing garments, shared food from the same wooden bowl. Men sparred, wrestled, slapped each other's backs in affection and challenge. Elders sat with younger folk, placing hands on knees, on shoulders, on heads, in silent blessing. These touches were not sensual, but they were deeply human. The body needed them. especially after a winter of cold and stillness. And then there were the stories told by those who had lived through many springs. They sat near the fire after the feast, their faces lined, their voices soft but unwavering. They told of old loves, of heartbreaks that once gutted them but now made them smile, of the woman who kissed them once and was never seen again, of the man who carved their name into a tree before leaving for the sea. These stories were not cautionary, they were offerings, not to be repeated, but to be remembered. And as the night deepened and stars stitched themselves across the sky, the younger ones listened, sometimes with amusement, sometimes with longing, sometimes with something they didn't yet have a name for. Because spring was not only a time of action, it was a time of reflection. The land was open again, so were the hearts. And the stories, old, new, imagined, were not just for telling. They were for carrying, for keeping close, for lighting the way to the next hand held, the next promise whispered, the next story made between two bodies beneath the leaves. By early summer, the air turned thick and fragrant, rich with the scent of clover, sun-warmed grass, wild thyme, and damp earth. The bees moved heavily through the meadows. The rivers, once rushing with spring thaw, now glided slowly under the weight of light. Days stretched longer than they had any right to, and nights came late and reluctantly, painted with soft blues instead of darkness. And in this pause between sowing and harvest, the people of the village found themselves suspended, neither resting nor laboring, but floating somewhere in between. This was the season of slow love. No longer sharpened by winter's urgency or spring's bloom of new beginnings, intimacy now ripened like fruit left in the sun. It didn't rush. It lingered, and in its slowness, it deepened. Couples walked farther together, wandering into the woods not with purpose, but with the joy of getting lost. They sat by the edge of the lake, bare feet in the water, speaking not of chores or children or trade, but of old dreams, or of nothing at all. Sometimes just breathing was enough, just listening to the birds and feeling each other's presence. In some villages, it was custom during this time for couples to sleep outside, beneath a shared cloak or furs, especially on the warmest nights. It was believed that doing so brought fertility, not only of the body, but of luck, ideas, and patience. Beneath the open sky, wrapped in each other, people whispered things they could not say beneath a roof. Truths, fears, names they had not spoken since youth. One woman, called Saifa, was said to have lain beneath the stars every year with her husband of 20 summers. They had no children, but each season they would carry their bedding to the same patch of ground, just beyond the field. There they would sleep, curled together, speaking only once the stars appeared. No one ever asked what was said. No one needed to. It was theirs. And when her husband passed, she continued the tradition alone. Some nights, villagers claimed she spoke as though someone still lay beside her, and perhaps in some way he did. Young lovers, emboldened by the warmth and the lack of walls, found new freedom. No longer confined to hidden corners, they kissed openly beneath the trees, lay down together in the tall grasses, whispered into one another's collarbones. Their love was not yet weathered, not yet bruised by time. It burned gently, cleanly. They learned each other slowly, tracing each new discovery with wonder, a freckle here, a scar there, a habit of exhaling too sharply after laughter. For these lovers, the act of undressing became a ritual, a slow peeling away of the world, a belt unfastened not with haste, but reverence. A tunic slid down with a laugh and a pause. The body was no longer something to be feared or hidden. It was a story, and they were learning to read it, word by word, breath by breath. In this season, even silence was erotic. Two people sitting with knees touching, not speaking, feeling only the hum of the sun and the way their skin responded to proximity. Not all intimacy needed the joining of flesh. Sometimes it lived in the waiting, in the ache just before, in the look held a moment too long across the weaving table or during the grinding of barley. Older folk understood this. They spoke little of their desires, but carried them like embers, carefully, constantly. They didn't need grand displays, a brush of fingers at the door, a shared wash basin in the morning, a half smile exchanged as others bickered over salted fish. These small acts were not decoration, they were devotion. Among some, the heat of summer brought not just love, but confusion. Desire, like the sun, could scorch if left untended. A man might find himself drawn to a voice not his wife's, A woman might watch the blacksmith's hands too long, imagining things she would never speak. These feelings weren't always acted upon, but they stirred the waters. Not every heart was steady in the heat. When these tensions rose, the community didn't shame them outright. They understood. Summer made everything more, hungrier, sharper. But there were quiet warnings. A mother might speak to her son about loyalty over stew. A sister might pull her brother aside with a firm glance. A wife might kiss her husband a little longer before sleep. A reminder, not a question. And still, love flourished. There was a ritual known as the leaf oath, practiced only in certain valleys. Two lovers, whether married or not, would each choose a leaf, often from ash, birch, or oak, and write a secret word on it with soot or carved in with a small blade. They would trade leaves without showing what was written. Then they would place them in the river at the same moment, standing side by side. It was said that if the leaves floated together, their bond was true. If the leaves drifted apart, the gods had other plans. No one knew how often the leaves parted, but no one ever admitted it if they did. The ritual wasn't about truth. It was about hope, and hope in summer was as thick as the air itself. It hovered in the spaces between hands, in the breath before a kiss, in the way two people looked at each other across a fire too warm for need, but not too warm for nearness. So they touched more, not out of passion alone, but out of instinct. Because the days were long now, and the nights were soft, and the sky above was too wide to carry regrets. They made love not because they had to, but because it was summer. And in summer, to touch was to believe that the world and the heart could hold this much heat without breaking. As the sun crested its highest arc in the sky and the year leaned into midsummer, the world seemed to pause in its ripening. This was the solstice, Solvar, a sacred turning, when daylight stretched itself across nearly every waking hour, and even the deepest night was painted with soft blue twilight. Shadows shortened, crops stood tall, and bodies moved with a different rhythm, unhurried, almost languid, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. The Vikings marked this time not with a single ritual, but with a season of reverence. Fires were lit high on the hills, offerings made to the gods of light and fertility. Bonfires crackled at the edges of the village, their smoke rising into the vast sky like prayers. People danced, drank, sang. But beneath the celebration was something quieter, something ancient, a knowing that this brightness would soon begin to fade, that nothing, not even light, lasts forever. And so, desire burned hottest in this short golden window, not because it was careless, but because it was precious. This was the season of consummation, of fulfillment, of the promise made in spring now fully answered by the joining of bodies under an endless sky. It was not uncommon for lovers to disappear together during these days, sometimes for hours, sometimes for nights. They wandered into forests blooming thick with fern and fireweed, laid cloaks beneath trees, and touched each other with an urgency born not of haste, but of knowing, this is our time. The warmth of the earth beneath them, the sun lingering far past what felt natural, all served as witness. For those long married, these days were often a renewal. Children sent to stay with kin or to sleep in distant parts of the longhouse gave couples rare solitude. They bathed together in cold streams, washed each other's backs, laughed like they had in their younger years. In the hush of the evening, as the fire burned low and the scent of crushed grass still clung to their skin, they found themselves again, not as parents, not as workers, but as lovers. For those not yet bound or not meant to be, midsummer offered something more elusive, a space outside of obligation, a time when rules bent gently under the weight of light and longing. There were stories, always stories, of lovers who met on solstice and vanished together, never to return. Some believed they became spirits of the land. Others said they fled to distant shores. And some claimed the gods, envious of their passion, had stolen them away to keep in golden halls beyond time. Such tales were often told around the fire on solstice eve, when the drink flowed and the embers glowed, and someone would ask, "Have you ever loved like that?" And silence would follow, not because no one had, but because many had, and none dared speak the name. Among the unmarried, the solstice was also the season of choice. Young women wove flower crowns and laid them on rivers, watching how they floated, whether they spun, whether they drifted to shore, whether they carried a blessing. Young men carved their initials into branches and cast them into sacred pools, hoping for dreams of the one they were meant to find. Some found their chosen, some did not, but all felt the ache of it, that deep, primal pull toward another, not just for pleasure, but for witness, to be seen, to be held in the brightness before the dark returned. In one village there was a custom of the midnight circle. As the sun dipped low, never fully setting, couples, both declared and secret, gathered in the meadows. They stood in silence, hand in hand or with fingers barely brushing. The circle grew slowly, lit by torches and the breath of summer wind. Elders watched. Children, if present, were hushed. There was no ceremony, no announcement, just presence. To stand in the circle was to say, "This is who I choose. For tonight, for always, for now." Some stood with lifelong partners. Some stood with someone they would never see again. It didn't matter. The circle held them all. And when the torches burned low, each pair turned away together, slipping into the long twilight to make their own story. That night was sacred. It was not for promises. It was not for oaths. It was for touch, for surrender, for listening to the body in its most honest moment, the moment when the light refused to fade and the body too refused to hide. In these hours, the world belonged to lovers, not to the gods, not to the village, not to fate, but to two hands clasped tightly, to lips brushed across collarbones, to thighs pressed against hips, to the long, slow unfolding of self into another, without fear, without shame. And in the morning, as the mist rose from the fields and the light sharpened again into day, there was no need for talk. The language of the night lingered on the skin, in the scent of hair, in the way eyes met and did not look away. This was midsummer, a time when love did not explain itself. It only burned. After the solstice, though the sun still reigned long and high, something had changed. The air, while still warm, no longer carried the same golden weight. Shadows lengthened just a touch more each day. The birds sang less feverishly. The scent of wildflowers began to give way to the sharper tones of ripening grain and distant smoke. The world, while still clothed in green, had begun its slow turn toward the next cycle. And though the people did not yet speak of it, they felt it, subtle as a chill behind the knees after a swim or the rustle of dry grass at dusk. Love, too, responded to the shift. Where midsummer had been a time of wild flame, late summer brought something more tempered. The urgency of desire softened into intention. Lovers who had burned brightly now began to ask questions of one another. What comes next? Will you stay? Should we speak to our parents? Do we make room for one another, or let the season carry us apart? Not all answered, not all needed to, but many, once breathless with hunger, now began to walk more slowly together, sharing the tasks of late summer, watching over the drying fish, gathering herbs, grinding grain. Their hands still found one another, but not with the same fever. Now it was a steady grip, a reassurance, a small weight anchoring the self. Among married couples, this was often the time of balance. The children were growing. The land demanded less frantic labor than it had in spring. The long days allowed for quiet companionship, sewing side by side, sharpening tools, rubbing ointment into sunburnt skin. Their intimacy was not a spark, but an ember, a slow, smoldering warmth that neither flared nor dimmed, but simply held. One woman, called Liv, was known in her village for her quiet love. She and her husband rarely spoke in public. They did not kiss where others could see. But each evening, as he came in from the field, she would meet him at the threshold and brush the dust from his shoulders with the edge of her sleeve. That small gesture, done every day without fail, said more than 100 poems. And when he passed one summer from fever, she continued to perform it for months after, coming to the doorway at dusk, brushing at the air where his shape used to be. In these weeks after the solstice, stories like hers were told more often. The kind of stories that had nothing to prove. No fire, no betrayal, no tears, just long devotion, just small rituals, just the kind of love that endures not because it is thrilling, but because it is known. Still, passion had its place. The harvest had not yet begun, and there remained pockets of time, nights warm enough for outdoor sleep, mornings lazy enough for extended caresses, afternoons thick with drowsiness and the scent of overripe fruit. And within those moments, lovers found each other still. A shared nap under a plum tree, a slow, silent undressing behind tall stalks of barley, a joining not for escape or promise or need, but simply because the world, in that moment, made it possible. There was a deep sensuality to late summer, not the showy kind of new romance, but a fuller-bodied sweetness. Skin sun-darkened, hair streaked with light, voices lower and slower. Even the act of eating, biting into a dripping pear, chewing thick-crusted bread, licking honey from fingers, carried with it the rhythms of intimacy. The senses led everything now. Smell, especially, played its role. A lover's scent, held in linen, the smoky trace of the fire in someone's hair, the tang of sweat at the hollow of a throat. These were not cleaned away quickly. They were savored, remembered, folded into the memory of skin. The Vikings did not fear the body's scent. They honored it, recognizing in it the map of their days. The sun, the labor, the salt of the sea, the trace of another's mouth. And then came the festivals of farewell, not of mourning, but of transition. Bonfires were built once more, not as high as midsummer, but still strong. Dancers moved more slowly, the songs had softer edges. These gatherings were less wild and more woven. Lovers who had hidden during spring and midsummer now stepped forward, hand in hand, to be seen. Some were given blessings, others simple nods of recognition. The village watched, accepted, or didn't, but the fire burned all the same. Among these flames, small rites took place. A girl might braid her lover's hair with strands of straw, symbolizing the binding of warmth. A boy might tie a carved token to her belt, signaling not possession, but presence. These tokens were rarely kept forever. Some were buried at season's end. Some were burned. But the act of giving, of accepting, of touching, stayed. One tale told of a boy who, knowing he would leave for the sea before harvest, carved a comb for the girl he loved. He placed it not in her hands, but beneath her pillow while she slept. When she woke, she said nothing, but that night she walked to the shore, placed the comb into the tide, and whispered his name. It was enough. Not every love needed an ending. Some simply dissolved into memory, sweet and shapeless, like a song you forget how to sing, but never stop hearing in the back of your mind. And so in these slow, golden days of late summer, love held itself differently. Not tightly, not loosely, but just enough. Enough to be carried and to carry. Through the stillness, through the warmth, toward the coming of harvest, toward the hush of autumn, toward what came next, whatever it would be. By the time the first grain fell beneath the sickle, something in the air had shifted again. The mornings came cooler now, and the breath of wind through the fields had changed its note. Lower, fuller, edged with a hint of rustling endings. The golden haze of summer was still there, but it carried weight. The weight of work, of anticipation, of the knowledge that time was turning once more. This was the season of harvest, wrathy teeth, the gathering time. The moment when everything the land had promised must now be claimed, carried, stored. No hand was idle, no hour was wasted. From sunrise to twilight, the people bent to the fields, to the orchards, to the hearth, and in that relentless labor, intimacy changed once more. There was less room now for wandering touch, less space for lingering kisses behind haystacks or long, aimless walks to the river. Desire did not vanish, but it was folded into motion. A hand brushed against another as grain was bundled. A quiet smile was exchanged over the clatter of full baskets. Lovers passed each other like oxen in the yoke, burdened but bound. And yet, in the strain, there was beauty. Shared toil brought a closeness that no feast or fire could replicate. The way a man tied the binding at a woman's wrist so her hands wouldn't blister. The way she wiped sweat from his brow without thinking. The murmurs exchanged under breath while others weren't listening. These were not the gestures of courtship, but of partnership. Not "do you want me?" but "are you with me?" And the answer, unspoken, was always yes. Even among those not yet joined in marriage, a different kind of love stirred now. Not the bloom of spring, nor the burn of midsummer, but a quieter weaving. A girl who worked beside a boy for 10 straight days learned the rhythm of his breath, the curve of his back as he lifted, the sound he made when the weight became too much, and he didn't want to complain. A boy noticed the way she tied her skirt higher at the knee when the reeds got thick, how she whispered to herself when sorting grain, how her hands, though calloused, still moved like wind over water. In these observations, something rooted. It wasn't passion, not yet, but it was foundation. And foundation mattered, for the Norse believed that love built in labor endured. that those who had sweated and bled and stumbled side by side would not crumble in the storm. At night, when the tools were cleaned and the fires lit, people gathered again, not for celebration, but for nourishment. The long houses filled with the scent of roasted grain, thick stews, baked apples. Conversation was quieter now, more reflective. Bodies ached, but hearts were steady. And in that hush, lovers still found each other. Sometimes it was a brief touch beneath the table. Sometimes a shared drink, lips brushing the same edge of the horn. Sometimes just the closeness of sleep, two people collapsing beside one another, too tired to undress, but not too tired to reach across the dark and find a hand. Among married couples, this was often a sacred season. The harvest tested the strength of the bond. Tempers flared, fatigue revealed old wounds, but it also unearthed new admiration. A man might watch his wife carry a basket heavier than her frame should allow and remember the girl she once was. A wife might see her husband rise again after an injury, teeth gritted, and feel pride so fierce it ached. They didn't always speak it. They didn't need to. But in the quiet moments, in the brushing of dirt from another's shoulder, in the mending of a torn tunic, in the holding of a bowl while the other drank, love expressed itself plainly, not as poetry, as care. Still, passion had its place. There was a tradition held by some villages during the final night of harvest, known as the binding feast. Once the final sheaf was brought in, the tools laid down, and the gods thanked, couples, both old and new, would come forward, each holding a length of cord. It might be red for fire, blue for water, green for life. They would tie each other's wrists, not tightly, just enough to feel. And they would sleep like that through the night, wrist to wrist, bound not by ceremony, but by willingness. The next morning, they could untie themselves, or they could knot it again. And those who knotted again were often wed before winter. One story told of a couple who, bound at the binding feast, slept back to back and said nothing all night. Come morning, they untied their cords. But weeks later, when a fire threatened the edge of the village, the woman turned first, not toward her family, but toward the man she had bound. He was already running toward her. They married at the season's end. In such stories lived the deeper truth of intimacy, that it was not always about heat or thrill. It was often about instinct, about who we turned toward when the smoke rose, when the wind changed. And so in this time of wait and work, love showed itself not in grand confessions, but in presence, in standing beside, in holding steady, in reaching down to lift when the other stumbled. It was not the season for seduction. It was the season for choosing. And every day in the sweat and dust and tired laughter, people chose again, chose still, chose even when it was hard, especially then. With the harvest gathered and stored, the tools hung, the animals fattened and counted, the pace of life shifted once again. There was a pause, not a full rest, but a slowing, a gathering of breath. The land, still gold and rust with late summer, gave its final offerings. The scent of smoke hung longer in the air now, curling from hearths and fire pits, clinging to hair, cloaks, and skin. And in the hush that followed the harvest frenzy, intimacy changed its rhythm again. It turned inward. The nights came faster now, and the sky, once endless and pale, began to darken into a deeper velvet blue. Stars appeared sharper. The moon carried more presence. People began to return to their homes earlier, drawn by the cool air and the promise of warmth inside. The world outside grew quieter. Inside, hearts stirred again. In this in-between time, neither summer nor yet true autumn, lovers turned once more to one another, not with urgency, but with a kind of yearning shaped by reflection. The days of bold declarations had passed. Now came the time for whispers, for glances that asked unspoken questions, for memories that curled gently around the chest in the hours between dusk and sleep. Many relationships deepened now. Those who had touched each other only in passion found themselves seeking something slower. A quiet evening spent combing each other's hair. A walk without speaking, just listening to the crunch of leaves beneath their feet. A shared silence that said, "You know me now. Stay." Intimacy softened, it thickened, it rooted. This was the season of telling truths. Not all truths were beautiful. A woman might confess that she'd once longed for another. A man might speak of the fear he carried, of failure, of death, of being forgotten. These admissions, once feared, were now given and received like offerings, not to wound, not to test, but to share weight. the kind of weight that couldn't be seen but always felt. And in that shared burden, love reshaped itself again, not into something brighter but something sturdier. In some villages, a custom existed for this season, the candle vigil. Couples, new or old, would sit beside a single lit taper, letting it burn down without speaking. The belief was that in the silence, hearts would align or drift apart. Some said the flame carried secrets, others believed it revealed them. But all knew that to sit with someone in that quiet, with only the sound of the wax softening, was to face them more fully than 1,000 words could offer. Sometimes 2 people would rise together when the candle died, hold hands, and go to bed without a word. Other times, one would leave, gently, slowly, but with a finality that needed no explanation. The act was not meant to break hearts. It was meant to protect them, to offer truth, even if it meant parting. And yet, many who sat beside that flame stayed. They did not seek perfection. They sought recognition, and when they found it, they stayed. Among the elders, this season was one of remembering. Their bodies ached more in the cold. Their movements slowed, but their minds traveled freely across decades. They spoke of loves long gone. Some passed into the next world. Others simply faded with time. They spoke not with regret, but with tenderness. There was an old man, Olaf, who every year sat by the river as the leaves began to fall. He would light a small fire, just enough to warm his hands, and speak aloud to a woman no one else could see. Her name was Freydis. They had loved once when they were young, but her family had moved east before they could marry. Olaf had taken another wife, raised sons, built a life, but he never stopped speaking to Freydis in autumn. Not because he wished for what had not been, but because he remembered what had been real. And so this season became, in many ways, one of honesty. People wrote runes on stones and placed them at the edge of fields, words they dared not speak but needed to say. Some of these were confessions of love, others of fear. Some asked for forgiveness, some offered it. The stones were left there until the wind wore them smooth, as if the earth itself took their messages and folded them into silence. Even the act of lovemaking changed in this time. It slowed, became less about climax and more about comfort. A body pressed against another, not out of craving, but out of recognition, of knowing this shape, this breath, this rhythm. Lovers no longer sought to escape through each other. They sought to stay, to arrive, to rest. There was tenderness in every movement now. Hands lingered longer on skin. Eyes closed more often during kisses. The body, now softened by the end of labor, no longer moved with fire. It moved with care. Among those who had been together for many years, this season brought a quiet reweaving. Not through words, through doing. A man might wash his wife's feet after a long day, speaking nothing. A woman might place a warm stone in her husband's side of the bed, knowing his joints ached when the wind turned. These gestures, simple as they were, carried the weight of decades. They said, "I see you still. I remember who we were, and I love who we are now." In this space between abundance and retreat, love became its truest self. Not display, not pursuit, but presence. And as the leaves began to curl at their edges and the first geese passed overhead in their V-shaped song, people drew each other closer. Not to burn, but to endure. Together, quietly, completely. By the time the last of the leaves had browned and fallen, the wind began to speak more boldly. It hissed through the rafters of longhouses, rattled the shutters, carried the distant scent of frost. The ground hardened underfoot. The sun, now pale and low in the sky, brushed every surface with a dim and slanting light, as if it no longer had the strength to reach straight down. This was the true beginning of autumn. Osmana, the harvesting moon. The frenzy of cutting, storing, and salting had passed. Granaries were full. Herbs hung in thick bunches from rafters. Fish dried in rows, their smell sharp and clinging. The great labor was done. And now the people turned inward again, this time not just physically, but spiritually. There was a quiet gratitude in the air, a reverence for what had been gathered, not only from the land, but from each other. And so, in these golden brown days, intimacy softened into something almost ceremonial. Couples, whether new or weathered by many years, moved gently around one another. Every shared act, lighting a candle, wrapping a child in fur, stirring the soup, became a gesture of mutual tending. They weren't just living together, they were preparing to shelter one another through the darkness to come. This was also the season when many hand fastings took place. Not always weddings in the grand feast hall sense, but smaller unions, private vows beneath bare branch trees, hands clasped in the presence of a few trusted elders or only the gods. These bonds were forged with the knowledge that they would be tested by the months ahead, when light grew scarce and tempers like firewood had to be managed carefully. One such couple was known in the northern fjord settlements, Rold and Inga. He was a quiet man, a fisherman with a crooked smile and little to say. She was the daughter of a healer, sharp-eyed and known to speak her mind. They had walked the same village path since childhood, shared winters side by side without once touching. But it was in late autumn, when the storms threatened, and his boat was nearly lost to a sudden squall, that she found herself waiting for him on the rocky shore. Without a word, she helped him drag the boat in. That night, they sat by her mother's hearth, drying their hands beside each other, and said everything they needed to without speaking. The next day, they braided red thread around their wrists and declared themselves bound. No feast, no songs, just the thread and a fire and a glance that said, "We have chosen." In this season, desire was more private. The need to be close was not performative. It was practical and primal. The air grew colder by the week, and furs were shared not only for warmth, but as invitation. There was a kind of sensuality to these simple acts. The way two people leaned into each other beneath a single cloak on a morning walk. The way one hand brushed another while kneading dough, fingers dusted in flour. Lovemaking became slower, more deliberate. Bodies were not just pressed together for pleasure, but for reassurance, to remind each other of breath, of heat, of presence. Moans were muffled under thick blankets. Kisses were fewer but deeper. And when the act was done, they stayed, clung. Not with passion, but with the full weight of "I'm still here." Among the unmarried, intimacy shifted in tone. No longer flirtation under midsummer stars, but conversations held close to the fire, voices low, expressions serious. A girl might place a bundle of herbs into the satchel of a boy heading into the woods. Not a charm, but a gesture of care. A boy might offer the warmest of his gloves to the girl who fetched water at dawn. These were not confessions, but they carried the same shape. Some bonds formed in these moments. Others simply lived and faded, as quietly as the fog that rolled in from the fjord each morning. There were also those who had lost love, recently or long ago, who found autumn to be the heaviest time of year. Not because it was lonely, but because it was honest. In the thinning light and the cooling wind, they felt the absence more clearly. The empty space beside them in the bed, the echo of laughter never returned. The memory of hands now gone, and yet even for them there was something to hold. A woven scarf once gifted, a story whispered in the dark, the feeling of a touch that still lived on the skin, even when the skin had changed. In some villages, a quiet rite was held each year before the first snow. A single candle was placed in every window, one for every love lost. It might be a spouse, a child, a lover never claimed in public. People would walk through the streets at dusk and watch the flames flicker. Some would cry, others would not, but all would remember. And perhaps that was what autumn asked of intimacy. Not new fire, but deep tending. Not conquest, but communion. Not passion, but presence. To sit beside someone in silence, knowing what has passed between you. To lay together beneath heavy blankets, not speaking, not needing to. To hold hands when the sun dipped below the hills, earlier and earlier each night. To say simply and completely, "We are still here." And that was enough. As the last leaves were swept away by the wind and the earth hardened beneath a skim of early frost, the world began to contract. The days grew brief, waking in shadow, working in shadow, returning home to darkness once again. Smoke curled from every rooftop, a soft gray thread against the deepening sky. The land, once golden and fragrant with harvest, now stood still in its bare-bones form. Fields were empty, forests hushed. The animals grew quiet, their breath rising like ghosts in the cold morning air. It was time to retreat. Inside the longhouses, people settled into the slow rituals of winter preparation. Furs were beaten and softened. Tools were repaired, leather oiled, candles poured. The rhythm of life now beat low and slow, and within that rhythm, intimacy tightened like a circle drawn closer around a fire. In this beginning of the dark season, love did not disappear. It became something different. It became endurance. The body knew how to adapt. Skin craved warmth not out of desire, but survival. Fingers curled into other fingers without needing to be asked. Lovers sought each other out not for passion, but for solace. The world outside was vast and unforgiving. Inside, they made something tender. A private world built of glances, breath, and heat shared beneath heavy quilts. There was no pretending anymore. The brightness of summer could allow for illusions, for sweet nothings, for playful distraction. But the dark pressed against the walls now, and in that closeness, people saw each other clearly. There was nowhere to run, no feast to get lost in, no field to walk away into. Only the longhouse, only the face across the fire. And yet, there was beauty in that clarity. A wife noticed how her husband's beard had grown silver at the chin. A husband saw how his wife's hands, once soft, now bore the map of every season they had lived through. And still he loved them. Still he kissed her fingers one by one before bed. Among those newly joined, those who had made promises in the golden season, this was the first test. Could a bond born in brightness endure the dark? Some did not. Whispers rose like steam over bowls of soup. He sleeps facing the wall now. She cries when she thinks I've gone to sleep. These confessions, shared between siblings or friends, weren't dramatic. They were quiet, like a candle that burned unevenly, still giving light but uncertain. Others found their love deepened by the stillness. They carved spoons together, spoke softly while mending cloaks, took turns waking early to tend the fire. Their intimacy was threaded into daily acts, a kiss placed on a shoulder as one passed, a hand brushing back hair from a tired brow. These moments were not marked with ceremony. They were folded into the rhythm of life, ordinary and thus extraordinary. There was a woman, Brynhild, whose husband had gone to sea and not returned. That winter, her sister moved in to help with the children. They slept on opposite sides of the longhouse. For months, they worked in silence, until one night, after a long day of spinning wool and sealing windows, Brynhild walked across the dark house and lay beside her sister. They didn't speak. They simply lay there, forehead to forehead, breath to breath. Whether it was grief or love, no one asked, and no one needed to. They kept each other warm. That was enough. In some places, the old rituals persisted. Charms made of twine and bone were hung above beds, not to protect from spirits, but to ward off coldness between lovers. It was believed that a heart could freeze as surely as hands, and so the charms reminded couples to keep touching, keep speaking, keep seeing, to not let the silence turn to ice. Elders told stories at this time, not of battles or gods, but of long winters survived together. One spoke of how 40 years ago, his wife had kept a log burning every night while he was sick, never once waking him to take his shift. Another told of how her husband, even in the coldest hour of night, would roll toward her in his sleep, arm finding her waist like a compass always pointing home. These weren't romantic tales in the way young people understood them. They were stories of devotion, of choosing again and again, even when the world was dark and the fire burned low. And for those without partners, by chance, by choice, or by loss, this was the season of inward intimacy. A woman might sew herself a cloak, taking care with every stitch, lining it with rabbit fur, not for display, but for comfort. A man might sing to himself at night, old lullabies his mother once hummed, the sound echoing in his chest. These acts of self-tending were no less sacred than the embrace of lovers. In a world where warmth was precious, giving it to oneself was an act of reverence. Sometimes when the wind howled outside and the shutters groaned against the cold, people drew closer. Not just lovers, but friends, neighbors, kin. They sat shoulder to shoulder, sharing broth, telling stories, holding silence. And in that space, love expanded. It was no longer just what happened beneath furs or between kisses. It was the blanket passed, the tea poured, the song shared. And so as the nights grew longer, as stars appeared earlier each evening, intimacy revealed itself not in grand gestures, but in constancy. To love someone in winter was to see them fully. To love someone in winter was to stay. By the time the first snow fell in earnest, thick, soft, and soundless, the world had gone quiet. Not empty, not dead, just quiet. The kind of quiet that hums beneath the surface of things. Smoke rose in steady ribbons from the rooftops. Paths between homes were carved into the snow by careful feet. The forest stood still, cloaked in white, And in the long houses where the walls now held in every breath of warmth, life continued, low, slow, tender. This was Vetnatra, the winter nights, the heart of the cold, the time when the days were reduced to slivers and the dark cradled everything. It was here, in this hush, that the truest shape of intimacy was known. It no longer concerned itself with spark or seduction. It had outlived the courtship of spring, the fire of summer, the settling of autumn. What remained was something whole, something worn in, like a fur cloak softened by many seasons. It no longer needed to prove itself. In this season, love became care. A husband learning how to braid his wife's hair because her hands ached in the morning. A wife rubbing salve into her husband's knees while he spoke softly of a dream he couldn't quite remember. They weren't gestures meant to impress. They were gestures meant to soothe, to say, "You are still mine. I am still here." Not every couple had love in this form. Some lived in a silence that could not be softened. There were quarrels, regrets, misunderstandings that festered in the long dark. Winter had a way of bringing forth every unspoken word, but it also offered a chance to begin again. Not dramatically, but gently. A hand on a back where there had once been distance. A cup of warm milk left beside a blanket without a word. Sometimes these were enough to mend what had broken. Among younger lovers, this was the season of knowing. A boy who had once imagined love as fire now learned it could be warmth. A girl who had once dreamed of poetry now listened for the quiet sound of someone stirring the hearth before she woke. The magic had changed. It was still there, but it whispered now, instead of singing. In the evenings, stories returned, not loud tales for crowds, but stories told in pairs or small groups. Old memories, family sagas, secrets even. And in that soft storytelling, people revealed themselves. Not all at once, but piece by piece. Like the way snow slowly builds upon the ground, until suddenly, without realizing it, the world is transformed. One tale told of a woman who had never taken a husband. She lived alone in a small hut at the edge of the village, where the forest touched the sea. People came to her for herbs, for healing, for advice whispered over steam. But no one knew who warmed her bed, if anyone did. Then, one winter, a traveler came, wounded and silent, and she took him in. They said he spoke only once during his stay, and yet she kept him through the coldest nights. When spring arrived, he left, but each winter after, he returned. They never married, never lived together. But for a handful of months, year after year, they shared the same fire, the same breath, the same silence, and perhaps the story said that was all they needed. There were other forms of closeness too, a brother and sister keeping each other company through the long nights. Two old men sharing tobacco and silence in a corner, no words needed after so many years. A child climbing into her grandmother's bed, feet cold, seeking comfort not in heat, but in the shape of a heartbeat beside her own. In these days, flesh itself became a gift, not in its beauty or its youth, but in its constancy, the warmth of a body next to yours, the sound of another's breathing in the dark. These were reminders that one was not alone, that even as the snow piled high outside, something lived still within. And when love did express itself in the body, it was no longer in haste, no longer a race toward release. It was a layering of touch, of time, of presence, a tracing of scars, a breathing into each other's mouths, a long holding afterward until both drifted into sleep. No declarations were needed. The acts spoke for themselves. There was a saying, "Love in winter is the love that survives." It was whispered like a truth, like a charm against the cold. And perhaps it was, because to love in winter was to love without promise of bloom, without spectacle, without audience. To love in winter was to make a home of another's chest, to press your forehead to theirs in the silence and say with your breath, "I know you, I stay." And in this knowing, this staying, this steady presence in the dark, the Vikings carried themselves through the hardest months, through blizzards and frostbite, through hunger and waiting, through memory and silence, because long after the fires dimmed and the songs faded and the feast tables were cleared, it was this kind of intimacy that remained. A hand that found yours in the dark, a voice that called your name in the quiet, a body that stayed still and warm beneath the same fur.